Welcome to another PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Jeremiah and Ruth, Western Historical Romance by Emma Morgan. Chapter 1. The Genesis. Ruth Gladstone woke up to a brooding sense of doom and despair. Getting out of bed, she remembered why she was feeling so low. Today was the day she was going to lay her beloved father to rest. A deep shudder racked through her body as she thought about never seeing the beloved face of the man she loved so much. Lying in the morgue downtown was the body of the man who had given her life and taken care of her when her mother died. She was only 5 years old at the time, and her father had taken on the role of both father and mother. For 3 years, they'd been so happy together as she became the focus of his attention. He treated her as if she were an adult and not a 5-year-old. Even though her father had been a very busy man because of his work, he'd still made time to go to the park with her or take her to the theater. Every morning before he went to work, he would walk her to school and in the afternoon would be waiting for her so they could come home together. They had 2 servants, but her father did nearly everything for her. For 3 whole years, he'd worked hard to ensure that she didn't feel sad about losing her mother to cancer. All she knew of her mother's death was what her father had told her years ago when she'd asked. Bethany Gladstone had noticed a small mole at the back of her ear, but ignored it. By the time she finally decided to go to hospital after ceaseless headaches and migraines, the cancer had spread, and there was nothing they could do about it. She suffered a massive stroke that she never woke up from. Miles Gladstone, left with his motherless 5-year-old daughter, did as much as he could for the next 3 years, but then the day had finally come when things changed. He met a beautiful French woman who had a 3-year-old daughter, fell in love, married her, and brought them home. Life had never been the same again for father and daughter. Gone were the long walks in the park, going to the theater to watch plays or the late dinners that they'd shared. Gone also were the long talks they'd had about anything and everything, and instead, she was relegated to her bedroom most of the time while her father sat at the table with her new stepmother and sister. But she'd learned how to cope with that, and over the years, as she watched her father withdraw further into himself, her heart had wept for him. Bianca, her stepmother, and her daughter Eugenie sapped the life out of him, and finally it had ended up in a fatal heart attack 2 days ago. She knew the reason why, but Bianca and Eugenie didn't. As always, Miles had been protecting them from the truth, or so he'd said when he told Ruth about the state of his financial affairs. "You've always been the strong one, Ruthie, which is why I'm telling you all this," he'd said just weeks before. "A series of bad investments and overspending has brought us to this point. But like other times, I will pull through, you'll see. Pa, will we lose our home?" He chuckled softly. "It hasn't come to that, and never will. That's a promise." Does my stepmother know any of this? Ruth felt that it was Bianca's fault that they were in this mess in the first place, and she should also bear some responsibility. Her father must have guessed what her thoughts were. "No, my child. Your stepmother can't handle this, and I'm trusting in your discretion not to let them find out. I will deal with the problem and things will go back to normal as before." "Yes, Papa." Ruth had believed her father when he reassured her that they would be all right. But eventually, the huge mountain of debts had rendered him almost paralyzed with fear, especially when some of his creditors began knocking at the door demanding payment. Many nights, Unable to sleep, she'd walk to her father's den to find a book to read, only to find him looking bleary-eyed and hair all tousled up. He'd worked so hard to try and settle the debts, and Ruth was sure he was going to get through it because he told her so, but then he died suddenly. She didn't know what she was going to do without him, but life had to go on. It would be hard to wake up each morning knowing that she was never going to see her father again. Ever since the doctor pronounced him dead a couple of days ago, Bianca and Eugenie had been closeted in the master bedroom, and she didn't even want to know what they were doing inside there. She had stopped bothering about them and their actions years ago. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to continue living in this house after her father was buried. Even now, she was doing it out of respect for her father and the friends who were coming to console them. Otherwise, she would have left the house a long time ago and gone to live in a hostel. After she had turned 18 and found work at a restaurant as a cashier, she had thought about going out to live on her own. It was only because of her father and how sad he would have been to see her go that she'd stayed on in this house. This had stopped being her home years ago when Bianca made it clear that her presence was only tolerated because of her father. She wasn't attached to anything and wouldn't be taking anything away as a reminder even if she had wanted to. The bank now owned everything value they had ever possessed. Bianca and Eugenie were in the living room when she went down for breakfast. As usual, they snickered as soon as she entered the room, but she ignored them. The kitchen cabinets were empty as always, and she sighed. At least after today, she wouldn't have to deal with this anymore. No matter what she did, it just wasn't enough for those two in there. In the past few months, she was the one who had ensured that there was food on the table, but most times, she went without. She was lucky that meals were provided for the workers at the restaurant where she worked, or she would have starved by now. Her stepmother and 20-year-old sister didn't care that the food had to be rationed so they could have something left over for the next day. If Ruth hadn't taken care of her father, he would have also starved. At her own expense, every day she had ensured that she packed lunch for him and walked the 2 blocks to his office, sat with him as he ate, and then went back to work. Of course, the expenses ate into her salary, but it was worth it. Leaning her back against the wall as she looked around the kitchen, which had become her refuge since Bianca and Eugenie never set foot in here, she sighed. How had it all come to this? A home should be a happy place, somewhere to hang up one's hat and find solace. But this one had become a battlefield, and it was a good thing that the restaurant where she worked was a very busy place. She signed on for overtime permanently just to stay away from this place. The person she had felt most compassion for was her father. Working as a government auditor, he'd had access to the financial secrets of many agencies, but because of trying to keep his marriage going, had made gross mistakes. Bianca had been his weakness, for he couldn't deny his beautiful wife anything, which led him to commit acts of fraud, and eventually his secret came out. His boss at the agency was kind enough to give him time to make good before handing him over to the authorities for questioning. That was what had led her father to mortgage their home, and which was why the bank now owned every square inch of it, and its contents too. He had also borrowed heavily from loan sharks, and she wondered what they would do now that he was gone. Would they insist that his family take on his liabilities? And even if they did, she didn't have any money to give them. The sooner she disappeared to save her life and sanity, the better. But even knowing what her father had done and the reasons why didn't lessen her respect and love for him. Ruth considered her father to have been a victim of his own humanness. He was her hero, the man she looked up to, and it didn't matter that he was just mortal and made mistakes. He was the one who had inspired her to take up an accounting course and become a cashier, and she loved her job. She often promised herself that as soon as things at home got better, she would further her education so she could become a full-fledged accountant and perhaps branch into auditing. Between taking care of her father and her busy schedule at work, she found that she didn't have time to do anything else. But her father had appreciated her efforts. "You're just like your mother," he would say. "She always took such good care of me." "Pa," she finally gathered the courage to ask him one day, "why did you marry Bianca?" Miles scratched his chin, and she was surprised to see him looking uncomfortable. "Ruthie, I never meant to hurt you. But I'm only human. I met this beautiful woman who looked so kind and had a daughter who I thought could be your sister and playmate. I'm very sorry that things didn't turn out the way I had hoped." She was brought back to the present when she heard something fall with a thud to the floor. The sound came from the next room, and she knew that her stepmother had done it just to get her attention. "Did you need something, Bianca?" "Princess, what plans do you have after today?" Bianca called out from the living room. "Will you continue to live in your father's palace?" Ruth decided to ignore her mocking tones. Her father had always called her his princess, and that had irked Bianca no end, which was why she often used the name to taunt her. No use getting into a fight with her family this morning. It just wasn't worth it. Since she was already dressed and ready for the burial ceremony, she left the house through the back door and made her way to the funeral home to escort her father's body to the cemetery. Uncle Jerry, look at me. 4-year-old Jacob Rusher was swinging from a low branch and screaming at the top of his voice. "Uncle Jerry, come and get me. I'm a little monkey. Come and get me." Jeremiah Rusher was passing underneath the dwarf elm and looked up, a huge grin on his face. "Okay, buddy, move over. I'm coming up there." "Jeremiah Rusher, I hope you're not thinking about climbing up that tree. For one, it's not strong enough to hold you, and secondly, I really don't think it's what you should be doing." "But, Jed, you're almost 23, going on 70, and climbing trees and swinging from their branches like a little monkey is for little kids, not you. Your son is up there." He pointed, and he's the one who called out to me to join him. I'm just being an obedient uncle. "If Jacob tells you to jump into the Grand Canyon, will you do it? You and I both know that if I ignore the summons of the little prince up there, he'll scream his head off and then think of what Abby will say. Don't use my wife and son as an excuse for you to scramble up the tree and shirk all your other duties. Jonah could use some help branding the calves since you know that everyone else is out on the range. We have to get things done before the hot months come in. Now scram and don't let me find you climbing up that tree again. You have lots to do." "As you say, brother, and just to be cheeky." Jeremiah once again looked up at his nephew. "Jacob, your papa says I can't come up to you." "I want Uncle Jerry." The child started screaming, and just like he'd expected, Abby came rushing out of the house. "Who's hurting my son?" "Ask your husband," Jeremiah said before he fled, laughing at the expression on his brother's face. Let Jed deal with his wife. As for him, he was getting out of there as fast as he could. "Hey, little brother, what's the rush?" Jonathan was holding the branding iron over the flames when Jeremiah burst into the barn. One of their workers was holding down a calf in readiness for branding. Abby and Jed are about to get into it because of Jacob. "Why?" "Jed wouldn't let me climb the tree to play with his son, and his wife isn't amused. So I told Jacob that his father wouldn't let me play with him, and the little guy is screaming at the top of his lungs." "You can guess how Abby is reacting to that," he grinned, uncaring that Jonathan was frowning. Jeremiah. Jonathan put the rod down and moved towards his brother. Don't you think it's time that you stopped playing your childish pranks on people? You're almost 23 now and a grown-up. I know that you're our little brother, but soon you'll have a family of your own. I doubt that your wife will be happy with you doing things that cause trouble. Stop right there, Jonathan. Is it wrong for me to have some fun time with my nephew and nieces? It's not wrong at all, and the little ones love your company. But it has to be within limits. For example, you can't go playing when there's a lot of work to be done. Another thing, isn't it time that you started thinking about getting your own house now? Jed and Abby's family is growing and they will soon need all the room they can get. Your mischievous pranks may seem amusing to you, but sometimes they create trouble between Jed and Abby. Those two need their space, and you're crowding them. Did they say something? He felt himself getting uncomfortable. His brothers and their wives treated him like he was still a child, but then, like Jonathan said, maybe he hadn't given them much reason to treat him like an adult. You know that Abby and Jed would never ask you to leave the house, but it's just the right thing to do. Besides, isn't it time that you started thinking about having your own little woman to come home to? Jeremiah smiled, all anger erased by Jonathan's words. He picked up the branding iron that Jonathan had been using and held it over the flame. It was true that ever since Josiah had married Tabitha a year ago, he'd been thinking about settling down. The only thing holding him back was that he didn't have a place of his own, and he hadn't wanted to ask Jed for permission to move out of the house. With all his brothers married and gone, he hadn't felt like it would be appropriate to also move out. At least not so soon. I'll admit that I've been thinking about building my own place, but it didn't seem right. Not with everyone else moving out in the past couple of years. If it was up to Abby, she would keep us close, like a mother hen does with her chicks. She knows that she has to let go, but she just can't seem to. So it's up to us to take the first step and do whatever needs to be done. I guess it's because all of us have passed through her hands. Jeremiah raised the rod from the fire and walked towards the calf he was to brand. She took on the role of mother to all of us, and we have grown tremendously under her care. He pressed it to the calf's behind, and it howled wildly, and then he released it into the hands of one of the laborers. At some point, the smell of burning flesh becomes normal, he said as he prepared to brand another of their calves. Jonathan smiled at the subtle change of topic. Well, it's better for us to do this right now, before summer when it gets too hot. Also, this summer, Sophia's grandmother wants us to go to Canada and visit some of her relatives. Isn't she too old to make the journey north? White Eagle is a determined woman, and she says that with the birth of our daughter, the time for her to join her ancestors has come. But she would like to visit some of the people she hasn't seen for decades. Your baby is still too small to travel. What will you do? Sophia said the same thing, but her grandmother is determined to make the journey so. Jonathan shrugged. Jeremiah got the strong feeling that his brother didn't want to make the long journey, but he would have to because of his wife. Sophia's father had been half French, half Paiute, and it had taken her over 20 years before she finally met his family. Now White Eagle. Her paternal grandmother was quite possessive of her, and Jeremiah sometimes sensed his brother's resentment. But a husband had to ensure that his wife was happy, so he was compelled to bow down to her wishes whether or not he liked it. If that was what marriage entailed, he didn't know if he was ready for that. Marriage curtailed one's freedom to do as he pleased for the wife's happiness, took precedence over anything else. His 6 older brothers were married to wonderful women, but a lot had changed. Now, they couldn't have the fun they used to when it was just them. But he understood. Each man had a wife and some even children to take care of. Things had moved on and they were all grown up. But he missed the carefree days when he would climb trees as much as he wanted to, while Jonathan disappeared into the forest to hunt and trap animals for their meat and fur. Judah would often be found with his nose buried in one book or the other. John would be tinkering with his many gadgets and inventions, while the rest of them teased him all about it. Even Josiah was now married and still on honeymoon with his wife, so there was no one to tease or make fun of anymore. "You look a bit dejected." Jeremiah sighed. "Jonah, do you miss the old days?" "What old days?" "When it was just us and we could run around and make fun, all that." "Sometimes I miss those days, but then these ones that I'm living in now are better. For one, I have Sophia and our beautiful daughter Chantal, or White Swan, as her great-grandmother calls her, and then I've gained 5 other sisters, and the number of nieces and nephews is growing too. Those times had their place, Jeremiah, but would you exchange these happy times for those really?" Jeremiah thought for a while, then shook his head. His brother was right. They had gained so much in the past few years, and their expanding family wasn't just all they had gained. Finding their maternal uncle, or he finding them, had also meant that they had strong ties back east. He was actually thinking about going to visit for a while, but only when the work on the ranch didn't require his personal attention. They had also each inherited a substantial sum of money from their maternal grandfather, and his own share was lying untouched in the bank. He hadn't yet thought about a project to put it into, unlike nearly all his brothers. Abby and Beth were thinking of opening a restaurant together. They were both strong-willed and determined women, and he knew that it would be a great success. Abby had the administrative advantage because before she came to Woodland, she'd worked in a restaurant. Beth was a great cook, and they were all in agreement that with her culinary expertise, their restaurant would never have an empty table. What was even more wonderful was that their husbands, Jed and Joshua, respectively, supported their plans in every way. The 2 men would be fronting the cash for the venture. John and Kate were also still thinking about what to do with their share. Mr. Langer had retired, and John had taken over the reins of the train engine building company that Langer had built. Joshua himself had started a construction company, while Judah and Lindsay were in the process of building a modern library and resource room. Jonathan and Sophia, with the help of her Indian family, had started a tannery, and even Josiah was now running the sawmill that he'd started a few weeks before he got married. Everyone was busy and moving forward with his life, and it was time for him to do the same. "You're right, Jonah. I was just hit by a wave of nostalgia, but it will pass. I know what you need." "And what's that?" "A wife of your own, Jeremiah. Then you'll stop feeling so lonely. I know that we neglect you so much because of our families, but you're free to come by the house anytime you wish. Sophia loves having you around, and even though Chantal is still small, she has started recognizing people, and so far, you're her favorite uncle. Thank you. I'll take you up on your offer one of these days." Chapter 2. Broken Dreams. The large gaping hole in the ground was a bitter reminder that Ruth would never see her father again. This all felt surreal, as if she was in a dream. Her silky strands of dark hair blew across her pale face, obscuring it from sight of the sympathetic friends who had come to see her father off on his final journey. The first spadeful of earth hitting the coffin startled her, and even as she watched, she could hardly believe it. Gone was the man who'd carried her high on his shoulders or held her when she fell. But in a way, she had lost her father long before his death, and it was all because of Bianca. Over the years as she grew up, she had thought that when she got married and moved away from home, she and her father would get closer. Walking her down the aisle and handing her over to the man of her dreams was something she had imagined him doing so many times. But now it would never happen. When she finally met the man who would have her heart pounding and her mouth dry, her father wouldn't be there to approve or disapprove of him. He wouldn't be there to give her advice about life as a married woman or even see her children when they were born. Her children would miss out on knowing one of the best men who'd ever lived. Fresh tears blurred her vision as her pain turned into anger. It was so unfair, illogical, and wrong that her father should be dead. He'd only been 47 years old, still in the prime of his life, and yet a heart attack had ended all that. Ironically, all this was happening at the beginning of spring, a time of rebirth. Her father had loved flowers, and she had made sure that she got a huge wreath for him, even though Bianca and Eugenie had jeered and made fun of her. "Princess, you're just wasting money on flowers that will only wither and dry up," her stepmother had said when she was choosing the wreath, with Eugenie nodding in agreement at her mother's unpleasant words. That money could have been put to better use, like buying yourself new clothes, and they both laughed. But Ruth didn't care anymore about their snide remarks and comments anymore. She would soon be gone from their lives and never have to see them again. Someone touched her arm, and she turned around to find the vicar watching her with compassion-filled eyes. Reverend Jones had been in her life for as long as she could remember. He had been there to bury her mother, and when she turned 12, had baptized her. Now he was here once again, burying her father. "Please accept my sincere condolences," he murmured. Ever since he had received news of her father's death, he had called at the house regularly and stayed for hours, not wanting to leave her all alone. Bianca and Eugenie, as usual, would go shopping, insisting that they needed to be well-dressed to meet those who were coming to offer comfort and also for her father's burial. They spent so much time buying useless stuff as she considered their fancy hats and clothes, using the little money that friends brought as their contribution towards the funeral arrangements. If it wasn't for the fact that her father had left some money for his own burial with his lawyer, things might have taken a different turn. There was nothing more of value to be sold because Bianca had either hidden or sold them off. Gone were the beautiful paintings that her father had told her had belonged to her mother. He had bought them for her when they were first married, and over the years, their monetary value had increased. The chinaware that had belonged to her grandmother was long gone, and so were the drapes and quilts that had beautified the house. The only thing Bianca hadn't been able to sell was the furniture and the house itself, because she knew that if she did that, the bank would be after her. All small movable items that had any value were soon disposed of, and Ruth wondered at her stepmother's greed. "It's getting too cold to continue standing here. Ruth, why don't you come home with me? Mrs. Jones would have come too, but she's feeling poorly, and though spring is here, there's still enough cold to give her trouble." The other mourners were slowly moving away to allow the gravediggers to finish covering the grave, and Ruth wanted to shout for them to stop covering the grave so she could see her father one last time. "I just want to stay here for a little while longer, Vicar." She wrapped her arms around her middle and rocked from side to side. Would this pain never end? How did people deal with such anguish? Her eyes followed the movements of the shovels as they covered the grave. "I want to see what they are doing." Her words didn't make sense, but she wasn't ready to leave the cemetery just yet. "I know that, but the last thing we want is you coming down with a cold or pneumonia. You didn't even bring a coat, and this weather is frightening, to say the least. Child, it's hard to walk away, but this is for the best." He took her hand and led her away. "I know that your stepmother didn't make any arrangements for refreshments, so I asked a few members of the church to do it. That's where we're all headed, but Mrs. Jones would still like to convey her condolences to you in person. Once we're done at the church, I will take you home so you can spend a few minutes with her. Thank you, Vicar. Bianca had scoffed at the idea of having refreshments after the burial, declaring that it was a waste of money. The truth of the matter was that she had squandered any cash that was meant for that, and had to have an excuse for people not to come by the house. Ruth was grateful that the vicar had taken matters into his own hands. She knew that Ella Jones would insist on her spending the night at the vicarage, and she wouldn't say no. The thought of returning to that cold and empty house without her father made her glad of the offer. Before the burial, she hadn't really accepted that her father was gone and kept expecting him to walk through the front door. "Thank you," she repeated, and cleared her throat. It would be nice to be around kind people who really cared about her for a change. She couldn't believe that Bianca acted as if she hadn't lost her husband. Had she never loved her father, Ruth wondered? In the earlier years, they had seemed inseparable, and her father had looked happy, but that eventually faded into brooding silences, locked doors, and her father spending more and more time at his government office. Bianca, on the other hand, went wild with her shopping sprees, and no matter how many times her father complained that he didn't have the money to buy all the unnecessary things she craved, she just wouldn't stop. She had to have the newest and latest fashions in clothes, hats, shoes, and handbags. Any money set aside for household purchases quickly found its way into her purse, and yet she had expected Ruth to provide gourmet meals for them. "I may only be able to stay for a short while," Ruth said, "because I need to go home just in case we have some visitors. Bianca and Eugenie may not be able to attend to them." Ruth, stop for a moment. Take a deep breath and let those two sort things out. "Your father was my good friend, as he was to many others, but you can be sure that no one wants to spend any more time than is necessary in your home now that he's no longer with us." "I'll miss him so much. How will I go on?" she whispered hoarsely, gratefully accepting a clean handkerchief from him because hers was soaked with tears that wouldn't stop falling. Why did he have to die? It made her really angry that Bianca and Eugenie hadn't shed a single tear for her father. It was as though they didn't care at all that he was gone. "Look at them," she pointed at Bianca and Eugenie with her chin. "They're strutting around as if this is a gala and they are beauty queens." "Ruth," Reverend Jones said in a gentle tone, but she heard the admonition too. "Be kind to your family. We all have our different ways of grieving for our loved ones. For you, it's tears, but they could be processing this whole thing differently. Be gentle with them. I don't know if I can continue living in that house with them without my father being there. In a way, he was a buffer for all of us. We'll probably just tear each other apart. Your father trusted that you would all be all right and went to his eternal home, knowing that he had left a grown-up and very hard-working child," Reverend Jones said as they slowly started walking towards the gate, so they could go to his house, which was about half a mile down the road from the cemetery. Though the house and church shared the same compound, they stood on opposite sides of each other, separated by a vast field. Be that strong girl Miles believed you to be, and make your father proud. "Thank you for the beautiful service," Ruth said. When they got to the gate of the cemetery, she turned to look over her shoulder one last time and say a painful final goodbye to her father. The bridal agency she registered at the very next day after her father's burial was an old establishment and had been there since before the Civil War. It was actually Reverend Jones who'd recommended it when he asked what her plans were after all this. "I can't continue living in that house with Bianca and Eugenie," she'd wept. They would soon drive me mad. Your father came to me a few weeks before he died and said that marrying Bianca was one of the things he regretted doing in this life. Why? I thought he was happy enough, at least in the beginning. If he was unhappy, why didn't he ask her to leave? The vicar shook his head. Your father persevered because of you. He wanted to see you grow up and be old enough to make your own way in life and thought that having a woman's influence would be the best thing for you. The vicar sighed. When your mother died, I didn't think that Miles would ever get over her death. He loved her so much, and it took him a long while to stop grieving. You were the one who made him come back to life, Ruth, and he loved you so much. He wanted to give you everything so you would never miss your mother. That was Pa, all right. We were so happy before Bianca came into our lives. Miles said the same thing, too. But he was an honorable man and took his commitments seriously. A lesser man would have sent Mrs. Gladstone packing, but he said that he put up with all that because he'd legally adopted Eugenie. I think he hoped that his and your influence would rub off on her and help her become a better person. But I guess he was wrong. Sad as I am that Pa is gone, maybe it was all for the best. Living around those two has been taxing, to say the least. But now I have to think about my future. Have you ever thought about becoming a mail-order bride? Many times, but I couldn't leave my father under the care of Bianca, especially not in the last few months. Miles is now gone, and you can move forward with your life as he would have wanted it, the vicar told her. Your father had a premonition of his death because he brought me some stuff in a box which he asked me to hold on to. The instructions were that I should only hand them over to you after his death, and by no means were you to ever take them to your house. Apparently, he caught your stepmother and sister poking through your bedroom one day, and they weren't able to explain what they were doing there. Whatever they were looking for is something no one knows. I always knew that they snuck into my room, probably hoping to find some money that I had left. Especially these last few months when things were so bad and Pa had no money. And they even took some of my mother's jewelry. Pa told me not to ask for it back, and I decided not to. He was a good man who made a terrible mistake that might have cost him his life, the vicar said, and Ruth turned a stricken look to him. What do you mean? He avoided her eyes and gave a small laugh. Think nothing of it. It was all the stress of worrying about the future that caused your father's heart attack, he said quickly. Now, let me get you the box that I was telling you about. Perhaps there's something in there that your father wanted you to see. No, please hold on to it for me until I'm ready to leave the house. Right now, I don't think I can deal with any of that, but I promise that I will do so soon. She decided to get back to the important topic, at least regarding her future. You mentioned me becoming a mail-order bride. How do I even start the process? My friend runs a bridal agency, and they're doing a good job too. They're sending young women to the West, and what's good about them is that they're a Christian agency. What's the name? Maybe I've heard of them. Maybe you have. Straight and Virtuous Brides is what they're called. The name was new to her, but she nodded for the vicar to continue. They are rather old-fashioned, and most of their clients from the West are good, solid farmers and ranchers. One or two businessmen too, but Gideon prefers not to deal with that kind. Says they're too shifty, so you can be sure that you'll find a good farmer or rancher. What about the fees they charge? Very little on your part because the man on the other side deals with everything else. How soon do you think they can find me a good husband? If I have to live in that house any longer than is necessary, I'll probably end up pulling all my hair out. I don't think it takes long, because Gideon said he only works with women who have been referred by the church. I'll write you a reference letter, and I'm sure that within a month or so, you'll be on your way west as a bride. Eugenie and I will be going to Washington for a few days," Bianca announced, and Ruth merely stared at her, wondering why she was bothering to inform her of their plans. They had never done that before. This house has become a mausoleum, and we need to get away from this entire depressive atmosphere. We're going to visit my cousin who lives there. Ruth didn't know whether her stepmother wanted her to respond, so she kept silent. "Aren't you going to say something?" "Like what, stepmother?" Bianca shook her head, a slight sneer on her face. "You walk around here with a long face as if you're the only one who was bereaved. I lost a husband and Eugenie lost her father too. Or did you think you were the only one who felt the pain of losing Miles? What a selfish person you are, Ruth." Ruth realized that her stepmother was right. She admitted that she hadn't been good company, operating between her workplace and bedroom. While she still provided for Bianca and Eugenie, that was as far as it went. She didn't bother asking them how they were faring and didn't offer information about herself. "I'm sorry. I hope you have a good trip." "Thank you. If we had enough money for the fare, we would have asked you to come with us too." Though she sounded sincere, Ruth doubted that her stepmother's amicable mood would last long. "I feel bad that we have to leave you in this large house all by yourself." "Don't worry about me." Ruth had a secret that she didn't want to share with her family. "I'll be just fine." She even added a smile to reassure Bianca. "Do have a safe and pleasant trip. It's absolutely necessary that we make this journey because your sister has been feeling poorly," which was an exaggeration because Eugenie had never looked healthier. "I hope she gets well soon." "Very well then, I hope to see you when we return. Goodbye." Chapter 3. To the West. Ruth was really excited about the journey, and mostly because her stepmother and sister weren't home to try and stop her from leaving. They had left for D.C. 2 weeks previously, and she had been glad to see them go for. Then she was able to continue with her plans of going west. Though the house was empty, she wasn't one who scared easily, and the silence was balm. She spent many hours in her father's study, just touching the things that had belonged to him, arranging and rearranging them. But finally, the day had arrived that she was ready to leave the house forever. Bianca and Eugenie would never know where she was because she had no intentions of leaving them any information. Those two were troublemakers, and the sooner she cut off ties with them, the better. Putting thoughts of them aside, she made her way to the train station. Her trunk was heavy, but the buggy driver was kind enough to help her carry it to the platform where it lay, ready to be checked in. The station in Annapolis was busy and crowded, but not so much that she couldn't keep an eye on her trunk. It would be terrible for her to get robbed when she was headed for her new life. Just as Reverend Jones had said, straight and virtuous brides had found her a good man in the West. He was a farmer who lived in Woodland, California, and owned a very large ranch. According to Gideon, the man was very wealthy and in need of a family because he was over 30 years old and wanted to settle down immediately. One of the stipulations of his request is that his bride will agree to getting married immediately upon arriving in Woodland. He doesn't want to waste any more time. Do you think you're up for that? Yes, I am. And he'd given her the dossier on Theodore Dyke. She had immediately liked Theodore's profile and written to him, and he wasted no time in responding. He was now waiting for her at the end of her journey, and she was looking forward to seeing him face to face. 5 letters on each side weren't enough for them to really get to know each other. But when he'd asked her to come to Woodland as his bride, she hadn't hesitated. Before getting onto the train, she sent him a telegram telling him that she was on her way, and then went to find a porter to help her with her trunk. She'd used her savings to purchase everything she thought her new home would require. Once the trunk was properly labeled and loaded into the luggage car, she made her way towards the first-class coach. Reverend Jones and his wife were waiting on the platform, and she was surprised to see them. "Did you think we would let you leave without saying goodbye?" Ella hugged her. "I'm going to miss you and your beautiful singing voice, Ruth." "Oh, Mrs. Jones." Ruth felt herself getting emotional. "Thank you for coming to see me off. And this," the vicar handed her an envelope, "is what the church members took as a special contribution for you. I didn't want to give it to your stepmother because I know that she would only have wasted it. It's not much, but it will help somehow. Promise me that once you settle down, you'll write to us from time to time." "I promise that I'll do that," Ruth promised. "Thank you so much." After they left, she boarded the train and located her compartment. She wanted to immediately make the bed and sleep, but also wanted to bid farewell to the city where she had been born and brought up. She would miss home, but her new life awaited, one she hoped would be filled with joy, for she really needed that. Once the train was underway, the conductor came and checked her ticket, making a brief comment which she didn't respond to, but just smiled at him. Then she locked herself inside because she didn't want to be disturbed. She had a lot to think about. The events of the past few weeks weighed heavily on her mind, especially when she thought about what her father had been trying to tell her just before he died. As usual, she had found him working hard in his den that evening, but he'd started choking and then grabbed his chest, gasping for breath. "Pa, are you all right?" "My chest hurts." He was getting short of breath. "This might be it." "This might be what, Pa?" But he slumped onto the floor, and she ran over to him and got a pillow to get him more comfortable. "Pa, I'll send for Dr. Reeves." But he shook his head, still holding onto her hand. "No time," he said. "Princess, forgive me for all this." "Don't say a word." Tears were pouring down her face. "Reserve your strength until the doctor gets here." "Princess, trust no one," he'd gasped, holding onto her hand, his grip really tight. "What are you saying, Pa?" But before he could say anything more, Bianca and Eugenie had entered the room, and he'd shut his eyes for the last time. When the coroner came in about an hour or so later, her stepmother tried to imply that Ruth had done something to her father, but he ruled the death as a heart attack. He assured Ruth that her father hadn't suffered at all. Now, all she had left of the man she had loved so dearly was a small box of documents which Reverend Jones had given her. While she was sure there was nothing of much importance contained in any of them, just having something that had belonged to her father gave her comfort. She had grieved for him, but in private because Bianca said she didn't want to see anyone walking around the house with a long face. To her surprise, her father had also given the vicar a few pieces of her mother's jewelry, and though they were expensive, she would never sell them. According to Reverend Jones, he'd said she could sell any of them so that she could get money for her use. But that would never happen. They were all she had left to remind her of her parents and how much they had loved her. Once she was settled down in her new home, she would find time to sort through the documents that her father had left, keeping anything of value and discarding what wasn't important. She had sorted through her father's clothes and packed them in boxes, which she had then taken to the church to be donated to the needy. Anything else of value had disappeared with Bianca and Eugenie's help, but Ruth didn't care. That they didn't want her around for the reading of her father's will hadn't come as a surprise to her at all. She was sure Bianca imagined that her father had a secret account filled with money which they would inherit and continue with their lavish lifestyle. But the solicitor had insisted on her being present for the first briefing, even though the actual will wouldn't be read until 90 days had passed. Miles gave me strict instructions not to read his will until 3 months were past. Why? Bianca had thrown daggers at him, but the middle-aged man ignored her. I have a right to know what is contained in my husband's will. Mrs. Gladstone, 3 months isn't a long time to wait, and I'm sure you'll find something to do to keep you occupied in the meantime. The house is said to be repossessed by the bank in 90 days, so you have enough time till then to make alternative living arrangements. Now, if there's nothing else. Bianca had raged, demanding to know what the will contained. She questioned, or more like interrogated Ruth about it, for days, but always got the same response. Mr. Cobbler has the final will and testament of my father. He said we should wait for 3 months, and that's what we need to do. I could sue him for keeping us from receiving our inheritance. You do that if you can, Ruth said. But if those were instructions that Papa, as his client, gave then, the court will uphold them and honor his wishes. Not if I can prove that your father was losing his mind in his final days. That's not true, and you know it, but do whatever you want to, Bianca. Because of being so busy in the days after her father's burial as she sorted his personal things out, Ruth slept for most of the journey to California. Theodore Dyke had sent her money for a second-class ticket, which she was able to upgrade into a first-class one. She had used the last of her savings so she would have a comfortable room and not be disturbed by anyone. The next time she made such a trip would be as a married woman, and she was determined to enjoy the luxury of the first-class compartment, even though she was still in mourning. Taking Ted's photo out of her purse, she traced the lines of his face with her finger. He was an average-looking man, but had a strong chin and nice, kind eyes. He was just slightly taller than her, but his well-built structure told of a man who was used to manual labor. She wondered what he thought about her. She had sent him a recently taken photograph, but he hadn't made any comments about it, just telling her that he was waiting anxiously for her to arrive so they could be married. Had he received her telegram? And if so, would he be waiting like he had promised when he sent the postal order for her fare? "Oh, Ted," she whispered, kissing the photo. "I promise to be a good wife and take care of you all the days of my life. See you soon, my love." She put it back between the pages of the novel she had brought to read on the journey. The house was all locked up, and she had left the keys with her father's lawyer so he could give them to Bianca and Eugenie when they returned. She was glad that she wouldn't be there to see the auctioning of the household contents. Maybe that was the reason Bianca and Eugenie had also taken off and gone to Washington. It couldn't be easy to see much-loved possessions falling into the hands of strangers. She felt sorry for her family, and even though they were mean to her most of the time, they didn't deserve to be homeless when they returned. But there was nothing she could do, and they were adults. She just hoped they would find a place to stay and settle down. Then she remembered the envelope Reverend Jones had handed her, and she counted out the money. $60 in small denomination notes, and she smiled. It was very kind of the people from the church to take up this offering for her. They had already done so much for her in the days after her father's death. Without being asked to, they would bring meals and sit with her for hours. Of course, Bianca and Eugenie enjoyed the meals and expected it to be a continuous thing. But people have their lives to lead, and after a time, it was back to fending for themselves. "Lord," she whispered, "bless them all." Apart from one of the porters who checked on her from time to time, she spent the rest of the journey fast asleep. The only moment she came wide awake was when they were about 100 miles from their final destination. She longed to get to her destination, get married, and just go home to enjoy much-needed rest. According to the porter who'd been so kind to her all through the journey, even bringing her meals at no extra charge, they would get to Woodland at 6 in the morning. Since she didn't want to miss her stop, she forced herself to stay awake for the rest of the journey. Ted would be waiting, and she couldn't help but smile when the train pulled up into the station. To her surprise, no one was waiting for her, and she thought that he might not have received the telegram that she'd sent on the morning that she'd left home. At least she knew how to get to his ranch. She couldn't find a buggy, but a farmer who had come to town for supplies very early offered to take her up to Ted's gate. "But you'll have to walk about half a mile to get to the house from the gate. Good thing you don't have any luggage," he said. She walked up the steps of the pretty whitewashed house with a smile on her face, which froze when the door opened and she saw Eugenie and Bianca seated in the living room. It was Ted who opened the door, and he looked very surprised to see her. "Ruth Gladstone, why have you come? What's going on here? What are they doing here?" "Who? You mean my wife and her mother?" "Your wife," she whispered hoarsely, a hand at her throat. "You and Eugenie are married. What about me and the promises we made to each other? This couldn't be happening." "I'm sorry, Ruth, but as you see, Eugenie and I are already married and there's nothing I can do. Besides that, I got your letter absolving me from any previous commitments that I had made to you." Ted allowed her to enter the house and then went and put his arms around Eugenie. Ruth's mind refused to comprehend what she was seeing. This was supposed to be her husband, her new life. What was Ted talking about? "Please sit down." What? Ruth couldn't recall writing such a letter. She was glad to sit down because her legs were shaking. "But I never." Her fingers tightened around her purse. "You heard the man," Bianca interrupted. "Why don't you just leave so that my daughter can have peace in her new home? Weren't you the one who told us that Mr. Dyke sounded like a con man and you didn't think he was really who he claimed to be?" Ruth had said no such thing, and in any case, she'd never discussed her plans with her stepmother and stepsister, so she knew that they had poked around her room and found Ted's letters. She opened her mouth to protest, but her stepmother wasn't letting her get a word in edgewise. This was what nightmares were made of, Ruth thought, as she stared at Ted Dyke, horror replacing the excitement she had been feeling. The train had arrived at the Woodland station at 6 in the morning, and the first sign that should have alerted her that something was wrong was the fact that Ted wasn't waiting to meet her like he'd promised. While she knew that he was a busy man, she had still expected him to be there because she'd sent him a telegram telling him that she was leaving home to start her journey. Now she understood why. "You said you wouldn't come out here, and out of the goodness of her heart, Eugenie didn't want to imagine the humiliation and pain Ted would suffer at your rejection of him. So she convinced me to come with her so we could explain everything to him. He was good enough to offer her marriage. My daughter took pity on this poor man that you had deceived, and now I see that you still want to make trouble. What happened to the man you flaunted before Eugenie and I, saying he would marry you? Did he change his mind and make you think that you can come here and reclaim your fiancé? Well, Tay is no longer a single man. He married my daughter 2 weeks ago, and as you can see, they are so happy." All those were lies, and Ruth knew that no matter how much she tried to defend herself, Ted wouldn't believe her. He didn't strike her as the kind of man to be easily taken in by lies, but apparently he believed what her stepmother and sister had told him. Even if he chose to believe her, which she didn't imagine would happen, Ted and Eugenie were already married. She chanced a glance at her sister and saw a look of triumph and smugness on her face and knew that she had lost. Once again, her stepmother and stepsister had bested her and taken everything away from her. It wasn't enough that they had squandered her father's wealth, and by extension, her inheritance. Now they had also taken her fiancé away and her future too. But like before, there was nothing she could do about it. They had won. It's all right. She stood up and picked up her small purse that had slid to the floor. At least she hadn't brought her large trunk with her. The farmer who had dropped her off at Ted's gate hadn't had any room for it, and it was still at the station awaiting her return. Go on. Leave now. Bianca looked like she would have liked to rush towards her and push her out of the house, but restrained herself because Ted was present. Ruth was sure that if he hadn't been in the room, her stepmother would have violently kicked her out. She walked to the door and then turned around and looked at her sister. It's all right, but one day you'll have to face up to what you've done. Go! Bianca screeched at her. I'm leaving. No need to shout at me. Opening the door, she stepped out and fought back her tears. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Chapter 4. Fresh Hope. Dejected, and feeling as if something had been crushed inside her, Ruth kept pressing her hand to her chest as if to hold the damaged part together until it mended. Walking down the steps and away from Ted's house, she could almost smell the smoke of her dreams that had gone up in flames. It seemed like ages ago when she'd stepped off the train filled with hope, yet it was just less than 2 hours. She felt like the world's biggest fool for having believed the words of a man she'd never met. Her heart, her mind, and her all had been so taken up in fairy tale that she'd left herself unguarded, which was why Ted and Eugenie's betrayal was a crashing blow. Ruth knew that it was pathetic for her to feel betrayed since she'd only known Ted through the letters they had exchanged and his one photograph. But that didn't stop the betrayal from hurting any less. She couldn't stop the tears from flowing as she trudged the nearly 2 miles back to town. Mercifully, Ted's ranch wasn't that far from town, and the first place her feet took her to was the small church she'd seen on her way here. The large doors stood wide open, as if an invitation even though nothing was going on around the church. She could see a man trimming the low fence and someone else was seated on a bench under a tree. There was also a one-horse buggy with the animal loosely tethered to the railing on the side of the church provided for that use. It flicked its tail and went on feeding, ignoring her and everything else around. Otherwise, there weren't any other people in sight, and she entered the church, praying that no one would stop her. She needed the peace and quiet so she could unload the pain in her heart. Lord, what do I do now? Ruth sobbed quietly into her handkerchief as she sat down in one of the back pews. The inside was dark, so she couldn't at first tell if there was anyone else there. Would she never find any joy in her life? If it's because of my sins, Lord, please forgive me. But do not abandon me in my hour of need. She was tired and hungry and wished she could take a bath and sleep, but all that would have to wait. She thought she heard a soft groan and raised her head to see who it was. There was a woman seated in one of the front pews. All she could make out was thick auburn hair. Having entered the church with tears in her eyes, she hadn't noticed that there was someone else inside the sanctuary. At any other time, she would have taken the time to enjoy the beautiful paintings on the wall, but now all she could do was weep as she thought about her failed dreams. Putting her head on her arm, which lay on the front bench rest, she felt the combination of sorrow and weariness beginning to take over. If only she could close her eyes and sleep and have all this nightmare fade away when she woke up. But that was another dream. Her own troubles once again took over, and she soon forgot about the woman in the front pew. Where was she going to go? For a day or two, she had enough money to get herself a room at one of the small inns. There was still about $10 left from the money the vicar had given her. Had she known what awaited her at the end of her journey, she would have used her money sparingly. Paying for good fifood and tipping the kind porter when he helped her with her trunk had taken most of the money she had. In any case, she had expected that her fiancé would be waiting to marry and then take her home. On her way back from Ted Dyke's house, she'd noticed about 2 or 3 small inns, which looked decent enough and probably didn't cost much. But even if they did, she would beg the owners to let her spend the night and then work to cover the difference of what she didn't have. But what would happen to her from tomorrow or the day after when her money ran out? Would anyone be willing to give her a job without references? She thought about referring to ask Ted for a reference letter, but then shook her head. He believed that she had rejected him because there was someone else in her life, and she was quite sure he wouldn't help in any way. Bianca and Eugenie had poisoned his mind against her so that even if he was a fair man, he wouldn't want anything to do with her. The sound of something falling on the floor startled her, and she looked up to find the woman at the front, struggling to stand up. It was only when she stepped out of the pew into the aisle that Ruth realized that she was heavily pregnant. She tried to bend down and pick up whatever had fallen. Ruth heard her groaning and got concerned. She wiped her face and stood up, hurrying towards her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She could see that the woman was really beautiful and from her dress, looked like she was well-to-do. "I thought I heard you drop something. May I help you pick it up?" "No need, but thank you all the same," the woman said with a smile. "My name is Catherine Rusher, but people call me Kate, except, of course, my father." She giggled and struck Ruth as someone who was always really happy. "He's old-fashioned like that. But I see that you're new in Woodland, or else I would have recognized you. I've not been here too long, but I believe I know everyone who lives in Woodland." "Yes, I arrived just this morning from Annapolis, Maryland. My name is Ruth Gladstone." "Welcome to Woodland." "Ruth, I'm sorry to have disturbed your prayers and meditation time, but when I stood up, my Bible fell on the floor." She held it up. "I managed to retrieve it just before you walked up, but I'm learning that pregnancy and bending don't quite agree." "I hope you're all right." "For now, yes. But I have to leave for home, and once again, my sincere apologies for disturbing you." "That's okay. I was about finished anyway. If you have chosen this as your place of worship, we shall be seeing each other, and please stop and say hello whenever we meet." "I'll do that." But Ruth couldn't go back to her own misery, not with the concern she felt for the woman who was waddling towards the church entrance. She didn't know what made her follow Kate, but a few seconds later, she was glad that she had. One of Kate's laces was untied, and she tripped on it. If Ruth hadn't been close to her, she would have fallen down the steps. As it is, she only stumbled, and Ruth took her weight. "I'm so glad you are here," Kate said, then winced. "What's wrong?" "I felt a sharp pain in my abdomen." "Ooh!" "This can't be good. I think I might have started my labor." Glad to be of service and forgetting her own sorrows for the moment, Ruth called out to the gardener to come and help her. "That's my buggy," Kate gasped. When the man came, Ruth sent him to bring the buggy closer, and they helped Kate into it. He even offered to drive them to the hospital, but Ruth told him that she could manage. In between contractions, Kate was able to give her the directions to the hospital, and immediately upon arriving, there was an orderly who helped Kate into the ER area as Ruth parked the buggy. She hurried in after them but found that the nurses had already taken over. Once they found out who Kate was, they made a great fuss over her. Ruth wondered who Kate Rusher was when she saw the attention everyone was paying to her. She must be someone really important, she thought. "Are you a relative or something?" A nurse came over and asked Ruth. "Just a friend. We were at the church when she went into labor. How is she doing?" "She's a tough woman, and from the look of things, will soon have her babies." Twins? Yes. Kate Rusher is well loved around here because her father donated enough money for new pediatric ward to be built. Construction is set to begin in a few weeks' time. Now you see why she's such a darling. Is it all right if I wait and see how she fares? Funny that you should ask. Kate said that we shouldn't let you leave, so yes, it's all right for you to stay. Someone will bring you something to eat. Ruth dozed on the chair until a different nurse came to inform her that Kate had delivered her babies and they were all doing well. "She'd like to see you." Ruth entered the room and stood in the doorway. It was large and there was a bassinet beside the large bed on which Kate lay. "Don't just stand there, Ruth. Don't just stand there, Ruth. Come and see the babies that might not have been born alive if you weren't there to help me." She approached the bed. "I'm so glad that you're fine, Kate." "Thanks to you." If you hadn't been there, she shook her head. "Hey, don't think about that. You're fine, and so are these two beautiful babies." "A boy and a girl," the proud mother said, beaming from ear to ear. "I was in church to pray for an easy birth, and the Lord granted me that. Now I want to go home." "So soon?" Kate nodded, "which is why I'd like you to take the buggy and go find my husband. He's at his brother's place today because they're raising a new barn. I was supposed to join them but decided to stop at the church first." "Now I'm glad that I did." She tried to sit up and winced. "Should you be doing that just yet?" "I actually feel fine. But sore, which I'm sure will be for a short while anyway. It's true that once the babies are born, a woman soon forgets the pain of childbirth." She looked at her sleeping children. "Have you thought of names for them?" "Yes. We had decided that if they were boys, we would call them Perez and Sella." "And if they were girls?" Kate smiled cheekily. "Perez and Sela." "So Perez and Sela, they are." Ruth found herself really liking this woman who didn't seem that much older than her. "Congratulations." "Thank you. I hope someone brought you something to eat." Ruth nodded. "A kind nurse brought me a bun and a cup of tea." "You were giving me instructions on how to get to your brother-in-law's place." "Yes. Tell John, that's my husband, to come as soon as he can," she said when she had finished giving Ruth the directions to the Rusher Ranch. "You won't get lost since it's a very busy road. Just ask for the Rushers and anyone, even a small child, will take you to the homestead." "Is there anything else that you need?" "Yes. Please tell Abby, my sister-in-law, that I need a change of clothes and something to eat. Please don't stay too long." "I won't." Chapter 5. Fiery Meeting. Jeremiah was the first to notice the buggy driving towards the homestead. It belonged to John and Kate, and he thought his sister-in-law had come to check on her husband, which was quite odd. According to John, his wife could barely get out of bed because she was due at any time, and for her to be driving the buggy meant something was wrong. They were all raising a new barn after receiving a surplus crop during the last harvest. All the womenfolk were preparing some delicious meals, and it was hunger that had made him abandon his own post and brought him to the front of the house. He'd been on his way to the kitchen when he spotted the buggy coming up the driveway and decided to wait for it. "Welcome, dear sister." He walked towards the buggy, a smile on his face. It died when he noticed that it wasn't Kate holding the reins. "Who are you, and where is my sister, in-law? What have you done with her?" he demanded. Ruth was shocked by the confrontational tone of the man she was meeting for the first time. Was this how folks in Woodland welcomed visitors to their homes? And she scowled at him. "At least help me control this animal before shooting off 1,000 questions at me." Jeremiah practically snatched the reins from her hand and didn't even bother helping her down. Once the horse was securely tethered to the railing on the front porch, he turned to her. Well, what? Who are you, and what have you done with my sister-in-law? She's the only one who should be driving it, seeing as John is already here. You seem to have stolen my brother's buggy. Why, you insolent man? Use the brains that God gave you. Common sense doesn't have to be purchased from the stores. If I had stolen your brother's buggy, would I have driven it right into this homestead? She glared at him. What kind of idiot do you take me for? The kind that would have kidnapped my sister and come to demand ransom. Perhaps you have an accomplice who is holding Kate hostage and you've come to collect the money. Are you out of your mind? If you think that about me, then you're a bigger fool than I originally thought you to be, and I don't want to waste my time speaking with you, for you'll certainly be of no help to me. Who do you think you are? And hey, Jeremiah called out when she started walking in the direction of the barn. Ruth was really angry at this man who was standing in her way, and she needed to get to Kate's husband. She could see some men working a short distance away. That was probably the barn they were raising, as Kate had told her. They might be of more assistance than this one, who was trying to block her way. He stood before her, but she sidestepped and continued walking. Where do you think you're going? To find John Rusher, who I'm 100% sure isn't you. What do you want with my brother? He ran and once again stood in front of her, daring her to take another step forward. If it's trouble that you're bringing for my brother and his wife, then I suggest that you leave right now. The events of the past few hours and anxiety about Kate made Ruth grab a large stick that was lying on the ground. If you don't move this instant, whoever you are, I'll hit you on the head so hard that you'll be seeing stars until the new year. You wouldn't dare. Jeremiah had never seen such a bold and beautiful woman before, and her hazel eyes were flashing daggers at him. Do you want to try and find out if I would dare? What's going on here, and what is the noise all about? Ruth turned to find about 5 men coming towards them. Who among you is John Rusher? She was tired and irritable and just wanted all this to be over. I am. A spectacled man stepped forward. What's wrong? It's your wife. Kate. She immediately saw anxiety enter his eyes. Has something happened to my KT? Not really. Well, what is it? Jeremiah said and received another flashing look. Kate went into labor and I took her to hospital. She's been delivered of twins, a boy and girl. What? Yes, she delivered a boy and a girl, but all are doing well. What are we waiting for then? John rushed towards the buggy that Ruth had just ridden in, his brothers in hot pursuit. Stay, he ordered Jeremiah as he started following them. Why? You need to bring the womenfolk to the hospital, or they will never let us hear the last of this, Jed said. Take the large buggy that has enough room for everyone. He turned to Ruth. Sorry, miss, we didn't even ask your name. Ruth Gladstone and I totally understand. Who will give me a ride back to town? Jeremiah will. He'll also introduce you to our wives who are in the house. They will want to know everything. Let me go with my brother, or he might get it into his head to run all the way there." Unbelievable. Abby glared at Jeremiah, who wished he could be anywhere else but here. His sisters-in-law hadn't stopped berating him for what they termed an unjustified attack on a poor, innocent woman who had come to their home to bring them good tidings. "You'll make Ruth think that we're Neanderthals and cavemen who have never seen strangers before." What were you thinking, confronting and accusing her like that? I said I was sorry. That isn't enough, Sophia said. How could you think that this sweet young woman had stolen John's buggy? Don't you use the sense that God gave you, Jeremiah? Would a thief or robber have driven in the same buggy they stole right up to the home of the woman they had kidnapped? I think you're listening to too many of old. Grizzler's tales of the Wild West. May I say something? Ruth held up a hand and they all turned to her. Perhaps it was also my fault. She liked that these two women were defending her, but she also felt pity for the man they were attacking. The other three had stayed behind to take care of the little children and continue preparing the meal. I should have introduced myself immediately when I arrived. No, my dear, don't say that. Abby said, Please don't get the impression that all of us are as inhospitable as this one here, she glared at Jeremiah. He could feel his sister's glares at the back of his head, and his neck was red. He had rushed in judging Ruth, but something had been pushing him, and he didn't understand what it was. She had such a sweet voice, and he swallowed. It's true. I allowed my temper to get the better of me. I'm sorry, Jeremiah. He couldn't believe that the woman he had attacked was now defending him, and he turned to give her a smile. Watch the road, Abby barked, and the others giggled as he turned completely red. Chapter 6. A New Home. The buggy was hurriedly abandoned, and Ruth followed the two women who were practically racing into the hospital. She didn't have time to find out if Jeremiah was following them or not. My sister just had a baby. Abby told a nurse they met on the corridor. Which room is she in? Her name is Catherine Rusher. Oh yes, Mrs. Rusher, mother to beautiful twins. She is in the private wing, second room, the woman said, and stopped to stare as one by one they filed past her. They entered the room and found the men standing around the bassinet. John was the only one who was seated on his wife's bed, and they seemed to be having an argument, which ceased when the three women entered the room. Abby, Sophia, thank you for coming. Congratulations, sister, Abby said, and hugged her. I brought you everything you told Ruth to ask me for, and some more too. As the family asked Kate questions about her health and passed the babies from one to the other, Ruth studied them all. 6 ruggedly handsome men. Make that 7, including the one who was just entering the room. It was obvious that this was a closely knit family, and she wondered if their parents were still alive. She had met Tabby, Lindsay, and Beth and tried to match each woman to the men, trying to guess who was whose spouse, but soon gave up. At least she knew that John was Kate's husband while Jed belonged to Abby. If Ruth hadn't been there, Kate was saying, and she felt all eyes turning to her. Ruth, Kate held out a hand, and she moved closer to the bed. Thank you so much for what you did for me. The two women hugged her, and she blushed when the men also did the same, except Jeremiah, who pretended to be looking at the children. We're so grateful that you helped our sister, Abby said. Thank you. It was the right thing to do. she murmured, aware that Jeremiah had raised his head and was now staring at her from across the room. Sophia moved to the bassinet and picked one of the babies up. "How long are you going to stay here?" Tabby, Lindsay, and Beth said they would be by later when we returned home. We couldn't leave the little ones alone. "Oh." "They shouldn't bother," Kate said. "I'll be going home as soon as I change out of these clothes and as soon as I finish eating this delicious meal that Abby has brought me." "What?" John looked at his wife, his glasses perched at the end of his nose. "You can't mean that." "Dear darling, this isn't my house, and you know how antsy I get when I'm not at home. Take your brothers out and let the girls help me dress so we can leave this place. I'm hungry and want a good homemade meal, not the rubbish I was served a while ago. This," she held up the food tin, "will sustain me only for a short while because your children are really good eaters." "Darling," John spoke in his most coaxing voice. "You haven't been here 6 hours, and the doctor hasn't cleared you to go home." "John, I love you, but if you don't go and convince that doctor to let me go home in the next few minutes, you and I are going to have a big argument." Ruth and everyone else listened silently as husband and wife argued. A smile of amusement made Ruth's lips twitch. While the argument was heated, she still sensed the deep love that the two shared. Kate had a stubborn look in her eyes, and it was hard to believe that just a few hours ago she'd become the mother of beautiful twins, Perez and Sella. "I'm not staying in this hospital." A single moment longer, her chin jutted out. "If you think it's so pleasant, why don't you stay here while the babies and I go home?" "My darling, you need plenty of rest after the ordeal you just underwent. I think you should at least remain here overnight, and I promise that first thing tomorrow morning, I'll be here to take you all home." "John Rusher, you're not listening to me. I said I'm not spending a single moment longer than is necessary in this hospital. It's getting late and we need to go home. What's wrong with you?" "Love, we haven't found a nanny for the babies yet, and I don't think Mrs. Pedler will be willing to take on any extra work. Besides, she only comes during the day for a few hours and will never consent to working over the weekends." "Who will help you with the babies when we get home? You're still too weak to deal with such a heavy task." "I'm strong enough to manage on my own, and I have the ladies to help me. Even if I spend a night in this place, which I certainly won't do, I'll still have to go home where there's no nanny. So why don't you stop trying to convince me to stay and go convince the doctor to let me go while my sisters help me get ready to leave?" She turned to her sisters-in-law, seeking their support. "Won't you be there for me, girls?" Abby and Sophia nodded. "See," she turned a triumphant look to her husband. "It's all settled now. Go and tell the doctor to discharge me, or I will walk out of here myself. No one can make me stay." Seeing that the argument wasn't getting anywhere, Ruth held her hand up, and it was Abby who noticed it. "I think Ruth has something to say," and Ruth saw all eyes turn towards her. "Don't be scared. Ruth, none of us bites. Just say what you want to say." She cleared her throat. "I may have a solution to Kate's problem. At least temporarily." "Speak up, girl," Jed said kindly. "You see, I arrived in Woodland just this morning expecting to get married to Mr. Theodore Dyke, but found that he's already married. I have nowhere else to go, and if it's all right with Kate, I can help her with the babies at least until she finds someone more qualified for the position. I'd like to work and make some money so I can return to Maryland." "Have you ever taken care of newborn babies before?" This from Jeremiah, and Ruth felt like rolling her eyes at him. From his tone, it was clear that he didn't want her anywhere near his family. Respect for Kate and the others made her keep a straight face. I'm just asking because I'm concerned about my new niece and nephew. While I have no experience, you'll find that I'm a fast learner. For the moment, she chose to ignore Jeremiah. Her success depended on convincing Kate that she could do the job and not him. And I'm a very hard worker because apart from taking care of the children, I can also do household chores. What do you say, John? Kate demanded, daring her husband to refuse. If you think it's all right, then I'm also fine with the idea. Good. Now go and make ready for me to bring our babies home. Yes, my love. Once Kate and her babies were settled in her bedroom at home, Abby, Sophia, and the others left, but Ruth was surprised to find that Jeremiah wasn't leaving with them. From the way he seemed to move easily around the house, it was clear that he came here often. Jeremiah will take you around the house, Kate told Ruth. Mrs. Pedler would do it, but it's almost time for her to go home. At least she has prepared dinner, which I will impose on you to serve. That's all right. Ruth was so happy. Her truck was still at the station, and she was going to have to swallow all her pride and anger at Jeremiah and ask him to fetch it for her. You mentioned that you had arrived just this morning. Where's your trunk? Kate seemed to read her mind. I left it at the station because I wasn't sure where I would end up. Kate turned to her brother-in-law. After you take Ruth around the house, please go to the station and bring her trunk back. She'll give you her ticket and you can collect it and bring it here. Yes, Kate. Which room should I take Ruth to? Choose any of the ones on the first floor in the south wing, Kate murmured sleepily. See that she's settled in well and then bring her trunk to her. The room allocated to her made her gasp. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. Actually, the whole house was. She hadn't stopped gaping since she'd stepped into the compound. The house looked like a small replica of the White House, which she had seen on one of the tours to D.C. with her father. It had 3 stories, and Ruth wondered if all the rooms were occupied. It was clear that John and Kate Rusher were very wealthy, and they had even offered her a good salary. I hope you're happy now, he said as he led her away from the bedroom after showing it to her. Why do you say it like it's a bad thing? You're a stranger and within minutes have ensconced yourself in my brother's household. We don't even know who you are. Have you any proof of your identity? He demanded. The question astounded Ruth, and she made an impatient sound. Since this isn't your house, Jeremiah Rusher, why don't you just leave me be? I have had to deal with unpleasant people this day, and I think that cup is full. Kate is all right with me staying here and helping her take care of the babies. So, what is your problem? In actual fact, Jeremiah had no idea why he felt so strongly about Ruth. Something that he couldn't explain made him want to lash out at her for no reason at all. Just don't do anything to harm my family. Look, Ruth was tired of fighting and arguing. She could feel a headache coming on. We got off on the wrong footing, and I'm truly sorry for the part I played in that. But I need this job, and I promise to stay away from you. She turned to leave. Where are you going? To the kitchen, to see what help I can offer Mrs. Pedler. It's this way. Why do you look like someone stole your last cookie? Jed asked Jeremiah as soon as he got back home. Aren't you celebrating the birth of Perez and Sela like everyone else? Jeremiah was exhausted and wished he could just wash up and sleep. John had invited him to have dinner with them, and sitting at the same table with Ruth had taxed him to the limit. John had opted to eat in the bedroom with his wife, so in the end it was just the two of them. He'd collected her trunk for her from the station and brought it back to her. To her credit, she had thanked him, but he still wasn't sure that he liked her being in Kate's house. You look tired, Joshua said. "Have some food." "That's because I am." Kate made me go to the station for Ruth's trunk, and I had dinner at their house, but I wouldn't mind a slice of Beth's famous chocolate cake. As they ate, they talked about the work they had abandoned earlier that day to go to the hospital. "We can continue tomorrow," Jed was saying, "unless anyone has objections. We need to get that out of the way and think about the next project." The women were discussing what an exciting day it had been, and Abby was telling those who hadn't gone to hospital how beautiful the babies were. As the conversation went on over his head, his mind was on the woman he had left in his brother's house. That girl. What does anyone know about her? Jeremiah asked, and everyone turned to look at him, aware that he was referring to Ruth. She could be out to cause trouble. "Just listen to yourself, Jeremiah Rusher." Abby practically hissed at him. Ruth was now the darling of the family, and the womenfolk didn't want a single bad word said about her. She was with Kate when she stumbled and would have fallen. "Ruth was the one who took our sister to the hospital and took care of her until she could find us. That's a kind-hearted woman, and I'll not hear you say another negative word about her." His other sisters glared at him, and the men guffawed. "I know." Jonathan held his hand up. Turning to Joshua, "Do you remember what we used to do to girls in school when we were little, especially those we liked?" His brothers nodded. "Jeremiah, you like this girl and are yanking her hair like we used to do when we were small." "I don't like her," he denied hotly, but his comment was only met with more laughter. "Oh, but you do, baby brother," Josiah said. "There's nothing wrong with liking a girl, especially a pretty one like Ruth Gladstone, and we all heard her say that she is single because Theodore Dyke wouldn't marry her." He grinned. "She's now practically family and Jeremiah. You have the chance to ask her to be your wife." Chapter 7. Settling Down. Very gradually, Ruth was integrated into Kate and John's house. After living in Annapolis for so long, she found that life in Woodland was a little bit slower. Not less busy, but at least someone could pause and take a breath. She found herself loving it and hoped that she would be here for a long time. It had to be serendipity at work that she had found such a wonderful couple to work for. And their babies made work very easy for them because they slept most of the time, and when they were awake, one of the other Rusher women were there to help except at night. In the evenings when John was back home, he and Kate took care of the babies, and Ruth found herself with so much free time. Mr. Langer was also the doting grandpa and spent a lot of time with the babies. The atmosphere in the home was something that she hadn't experienced in a long time. There was a lot of laughter and joy, and even when she made mistakes, no one scolded her angrily or sought to humiliate and make her feel worthless. "This is also a learning experience for me," Kate had told her just a few minutes ago when she dropped one of the glass feeding bottles and it cracked open, spilling its entire contents on the floor. "The good thing is that you're a willing learner, and that's what makes you such a fantastic nanny. I'm glad I decided to give you a chance to stay with us. Don't worry about making mistakes, for that's how we learn. When you finally get your own little ones, you'll be the perfect mother." "You're really very kind for saying that." She picked up the larger pieces and then swept the rest onto a dustpan, which she brought from the closet in the hallway. "Let me just get rid of these so no one will get hurt. I could go by Monroe's place and buy a replacement bottle." "Not necessary. My father went overboard and bought enough to last us until the next century." Which wasn't quite true, but Fred Langer wasn't sparing a single cent when it came to his grandchildren. "There are so many bottles in this house that I'm thinking of donating some to the hospital." When Ruth had cleaned up the mess, she returned to the living room. "Is there anything else you would like me to do for you, Kate?" Mrs. Peddler is just finishing up on lunch preparations, and I'd like to go and help her. Well, seeing as the babies are still waiting to be nursed, so they can sleep and will most likely be out for a while, there is something I want you to do for me, but after lunch, anything. Kate was nursing Perez, and Selah was in the bassinet, making soft noises. Ruth picked her up and held her close. Give me that other baby, as this one is very full and about to fall asleep. They exchanged babies. My engagement ring has lost its luster, and I'd like for you to take it to Monroe so he can polish it for me. Sure. Once you put Perez to bed in the room, please bring me my ring box, which is on my bedside table. It's your fault for being such an efficient nanny and making me lazy. Now I don't want to raise a finger but just sit here day in, day out, being waited on. Ruth smiled at her employer, feeling that she was the one who was more blessed. She had a large bedroom to herself, plenty of good food to eat, and a good salary. She hoped Kate would let her stay for a very long time. With the experience she was gaining, it would be easy for her to get another job even after the Rushers had no more need for her. Let me get Perez to bed and bring the box to you. Thank you. Kate prepared to nurse Selah. I'll also lie down for a while after lunch. Abby and Sophia are coming by later on, and I want to be alert while they are around. We started a quilting bee, and you can also be part of it. That would be nice. She went to bring the jewelry box that Kate had requested. Here, Kate took the ring out of its box. John doesn't like it when I don't wear it, but my fingers have now gone back to their normal size, so I will put it on once you get it polished. She looked at her various rings. They all didn't fit me when I was pregnant because my fingers were so fat. She poked through the box. Oh yes, you can also take 1 or 2 bracelets for polishing too, and then you can have this one. She held out a gold-coated bracelet. I bought it when I was in Washington with Pa, and it will go nicely with the dress you wore on Sunday. I couldn't take it. It was so beautiful, and Ruth gasped. Her mother's jewelry was beautiful, but this one was exquisite. Ruth, I'd like you to have it. Also, when you're taking the ring to Monroe, wear it on your finger so that you don't misplace it. Wait for the man to polish it and then put it back on. It's very precious to me, and I wouldn't like it to get lost. It was the very first ring that my husband gave me when he asked me to marry him, and I love it and him so much. Ruth felt uncomfortable wearing her mistress's ring, but she soon found out that when Kate gave an order, she liked to be obeyed. It was with much reluctance that she put the ring on, and she guarded her finger so nothing would happen to it as she made her way to the store. "What's wrong with you now?" Bianca scowled at her daughter. "Why the long face?" "Mother, I'm tired." "That's all," Eugenie said, wishing her mother would leave her alone. She was feeling restless and depressed, and just that morning, she had had a fight with her husband who didn't understand why she was always asking him for money. In actual fact, it was because of her mother that she had to keep asking Ted for money. "I'd like to go and get some things from the store and want you to accompany me." "Can't you go alone?" She was irritated and her head was hurting her. She'd been feeling ill for a few days now, but didn't know what was wrong with her. "Eugenie, don't you know that shopping is good for dispelling depression? Come, I'll even buy you something to cheer you up. I just wish your husband wasn't so mean with his money." "Mother." Stop looking so shocked. "When we came here, I expected that your husband would take good care of us, but the man is so mean. I thought you said he had money?" "Mother, please." Well, at least I still have some left over from last time. In any case, Ted has a tab at the store and will just go and shop and charge everything to his account. My husband said that account is for purchasing foodstuff and household items, not shopping for clothes or shoes, Mother. Your husband should realize that you need new clothes and shoes. We can't wear the same clothes each time we go out because people will start looking down on us and saying that we're poor. She clicked. Why don't you convince him to open a tab for you at that fancy clothing store? Eugenie shook her head, knowing that she wouldn't be doing that any time soon. She was afraid of what her husband would say when he found out that her mother was going to use the account at the store for her own personal items. He'd threatened to close it if they continued misusing it. But what was she supposed to do when her mother was determined to go to the store? She would go along and try to control her purchases as much as possible. The last thing she wanted was another quarrel with Ted. "What are you doing here?" Ruth groaned inwardly when she heard the voice that she'd been praying never to hear for a long time. "Ruth, what are you still doing here in Woodland, and yet I had specifically asked you to leave? Ted also said you should leave this town because you're nothing but a troublemaker." It was surprising that she'd been in Woodland for almost a month, but hadn't run into Bianca or Eugenie, not even at church, but she knew that the two of them never went to church, even back in Annapolis. But she'd seen Ted once or twice, and he'd ignored her. Not that she even minded, for her mind was currently filled with thoughts of Jeremiah Rusher. The man came by the house every chance he got, and their meetings were brief and tension-filled, so that she had started avoiding him whenever he was around. "I'm talking to you. Stop ignoring me. Didn't Ted tell you to leave Woodland for good?" Of course, the man had said no such thing, but Ruth wasn't about to start arguing with her stepmother, for she knew the older woman was spoiling for a fight so she could humiliate her in public. So she took a deep breath and turned around, surprised to find Eugenie also standing beside her mother in the store. It was the expression on her stepsister's face that caught Ruth's eye. Gone was the arrogant and smug look, and instead, Eugenie looked really miserable. It was clearly obvious that she wasn't the happy, blushing bride of a few weeks ago. What could have gone wrong in just a month? Ruth wondered. "Mrs. Gladstone," Monroe called out from the back of the store before Ruth could answer her stepmother's question. "Would you come back here and look at these materials? These came in just this morning, and you're the first person to look at them. I made sure that I kept them aside so you could make your selection." From Monroe's tone, Ruth deduced that Bianca was a good customer, and he was doing all he could to please her. She was also relieved that the store clerk had diverted her stepmother's attention away from her. "About time, too," Bianca muttered ungraciously, giving Ruth a sharp look before walking away. As Ruth turned to leave, she felt a hand on her arm and stopped. "Please, may I speak with you?" Eugenie asked in a soft voice. "Please, Ruth." She was quite taken aback, because her sister had never addressed her in such a polite tone before. "Sure, what do you have in mind?" What was going on here? Eugenie looked towards the back as if in fear of her mother. "I've been praying and hoping that I would meet you, so I can ask for your forgiveness." What? Ruth thought she was dreaming. My forgiveness for what? "I wronged you so badly in so many ways, and my heart has not been at peace for a long time. When you showed up at my house, I thought I could continue living with the lies that I told my husband, but they're weighing so heavily on my mind." Eugenie shook her head. "You've always been kind to me ever since I was a little girl, but I repaid you by being mean and stealing your fiancé." Ruth was stunned. A heartfelt apology was something she'd never expected to hear coming out of her sister's mouth. What had they done with the real Eugenie? "I know that you can never forgive me for all this, but please don't tell my husband any of this." Ruth was curious as to how her sister had managed to take her place. "Tell me something. How is it that you and Bianca ended up here, and I never shared any information about Ted with you? How did you find out about him?" Eugenie looked like she wanted to cry and twisted her fingers nervously. "I went into your bedroom and found the letters that Ted had written to you, and I'm sorry." "Really? So you wrote to him and told him all those lies?" The younger woman shook her head. "I showed them to Mother, and she said that we needed to secure my future. Ted sounded like a good man, which he is, and we didn't want to waste any time. So Mother told you that we were going to Washington, D.C., when we were actually coming here." "Go on." "We found Ted and T." Her voice trailed away. "You have done mean things to me in the past, Eugenie, but this was just beyond what I would have thought you capable of." "I know, and I'm so sorry. Please don't tell my husband. At least let me have a good home." "Did you even think about me when you were doing all this to me, Eugenie? If you don't forgive me, I'll never have peace." Over the days, Ruth had thought about how she would react when she finally came face to face with her sister and found that she felt nothing but compassion for her. "No, no, Eugenie. I forgive you. I'm just so happy that—" "What's going on over there?" Bianca's voice cut through their happy moment. "Eugenie, get away from that woman right now." "Go, Eugenie. Don't make your mother angry. I'll find a way to come see you." "That will be nice," Ruth said, though she doubted that Eugenie would actually go through with that. Her mother was too overbearing and overprotective to let her out of her sight. It had often troubled Ruth why her stepmother was like that. But then what did she know? She wasn't a mother, so she couldn't judge. If she thought that Bianca was done with her, she was wrong. As she was getting ready to get the ring off and hand it over to Monroe, she heard the dreaded voice again. "What are you doing with that?" Bianca grabbed Ruth's hand and stared at the ring on her finger. "Where did you get this ring? Or did you steal it like you always take everything else?" "Bianca, please stop with the drama. This is my ring." "Since when?" "Since I got engaged to someone right here in Woodland. You see, Ted Dyke may have rejected me and married my sister, but there are other good men in this town, too. To my surprise, one of them decided that I'm good enough to be his wife. That's the reason that I'm still here, stepmother, and wearing his ring." She hoped Monroe wouldn't sell her out, and thanked him silently when he winked at her. "Oh, really?" "Yes, really." "I don't believe you, Ruth. You were always a troublesome child, and that hasn't changed a bit. Who is this man?" "Wouldn't you like to know?" Ruth had the upper hand in this case, and it made her feel good to know that she had her stepmother all troubled. "Just know this. He's one of the prominent men in this town, and I will soon have the pleasure of sending you an invitation to our wedding." "We'll see about that. You're a troublemaker, and I'll make sure your so-called fiancé, if he even exists, gets to hear of it." "Mother, not here, please." Eugenie put a hand on her mother's arm, but it was flung off. "Stay out of this, Eugenie. This woman," Bianca pointed a finger at Ruth, "is trouble." Monroe, sensing that things might get out of hand, drew closer. "Ruth, there are some things that Mrs. Rusher needed you to bring her." He took her hand and led her away, forcing Bianca to stop the attack. Ruth was glad to see them leave the store. "Thank you for that, Mr. Monroe." He waved an arm at her. "I don't like trouble, and besides, this is a store. There are people coming and going, and drama isn't good for business." Jeremiah walked up to his brother's door, but before he could raise his hand to ring the bell, the door was opened and Ruth stepped out. She was dressed in a beautiful cream dress, but it was the bracelet on her hand that caught his attention. The smile he had been about to bestow on her died on his lip. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, grabbing her hand. "You're hurting my hand. Let me go." Ruth tried to twist her hand away, but his grip was too strong. "Jeremiah, you're hurting me. It isn't enough that you forced yourself into this house. Now you're stealing my sister-in-law's jewelry too. What kind of a person are you, Ruth?" "But I know you think that Kate is a wealthy woman and won't miss any of her things, but you're wrong. She will be very annoyed, and I hope you get fired for stealing." "Give it to me." He tugged at it and the clasp broke, scratching Ruth and causing her to bleed. "See what you've done." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she turned around, bumping into John, who was coming to see what the commotion was all about. "What's going on here?" He looked at his brother, and they watched Ruth as she fled from the doorstep. "Jeremiah, what did you do?" "I noticed that Ruth was wearing Kate's bracelet." He held it up. "I had to get it back. Honestly, John, why did you bring that girl into your house without getting any references?" John merely leaned back and studied him thoughtfully, making him feel uncomfortable. "What?" "You amaze me, Jeremiah. Did it even occur to you that Kate might have gifted that bracelet to Ruth? Why are you so hasty to judge the poor woman?" "Well, did she? I don't like that she feels so free in this house. You can ask Kate yourself about that bracelet," and he stepped aside to allow his wife to pass. "Why is Ruth so upset?" Kate looked from her husband to his brother. "What did you say to her?" "Ask him." John pointed at Jeremiah and then chuckled softly. "Why do you have Ruth's bracelet in your hand, Jeremiah?" Kate narrowed her eyes at him. "I thought that she had stolen it." "You did what? Jeremiah Rusher?" He felt like the world's greatest fool. "I thought Ruth had taken your bracelet and was wearing it without your permission. I don't believe that you had the audacity to accuse her of stealing from me. Jeremiah, what's wrong with you?" "I'm sorry." At that particular moment, he wished the ground would open up and swallow him. He cleared his throat, but before he could say a word, Kate held up a hand. "I have noticed that you like attacking Ruth for no reason. This isn't the first time that you've made her cry, and I don't like it one bit. I love you, Jeremiah, but I'm going to have to ask you to stay away from my house because you clearly have your own prejudices against this poor girl." "Kate, please, I'm sorry." "I'm not the one you should be apologizing to." And she gave him one last glare, turned and entered her house. Jeremiah stood on the doorstep not knowing what to do. "Either come in or take your leave, but don't leave the door open. The draft will cause my children to get sick," John told him, and he stepped into the house. "Sit down, Jeremiah." He sat and waited for the berating that he knew would come. Instead, John sighed and shook his head. "It's clear that you have mixed feelings about Ruth, and until you sort them out, I support my wife when she says that you shouldn't come here." "What am I going to do?" "Find Ruth and apologize to her. That's an expensive bracelet, and you broke the clasp. That isn't something that Monroe can fix, so you have to take it to Sacramento and find a good jeweler to repair it." Ruth was in her bedroom, wiping the tears away, when she heard a soft knock on the door. At first, she thought it was Jeremiah, and since he was the last person she wanted to see, kept silent. "Ruth," Kate called out. "It's me. May I please come in?" "Sure." She stood up and opened the door. Please come in. Did you need me for something? No, but I know that Jeremiah upset you so much, and I came to see how you are. Why does he hate me so much? She found herself sobbing again. I try to keep away from him, but every time he comes here, he just upsets me. Kate smiled secretly, knowing what was going on, but it wasn't up to her to reveal anything. I'm sorry, she said instead. He accused me of stealing the bracelet from you and broke its clasp. Ruth, I'm sorry about that. John is talking to him, and I asked him not come by the house until he learns how to treat you like you're part of this family, which indeed you are. Thank you. She didn't know whether to be relieved or sad at the news. Jeremiah Rusher had her in knots. I don't want to cause trouble in your family, so maybe I should just leave. No way, Kate said strongly. My brother-in-law will just have to learn how to deal with your presence here. Besides, this is my house, and apart from being my children's nanny, you're also my friend. You're also my friend. You're not going anywhere, Ruth. Now wipe your tears and go and check on the baby. Yes, ma'am. Chapter 8. Troublesome Times. Ruth sat on the low-lying wall behind the house. On one side of it was the beautiful garden that she had started for Kate, and she could already see that the flowers were starting to bloom. Too bad that it would soon be summer, and they would get scorched, but at least they would provide beauty for some weeks. Then the winter rains would come, and only the strong ones might survive. But then, like always, spring would come, and the cycle of life would begin once again. It looks really pretty, and the flowers will be awesome, she heard the deep voice, but not as pretty as the person who planted them. Kate, you mean? Of course not, Jeremiah grinned at her. You know what I mean? I don't. He was the last person she should be talking to after the last time when he had accused her of stealing Kate's bracelet. What do you want? Come to check if I have stolen the family silver? I deserve that, he said softly. He hadn't seen her for 3 days. I came to say that I'm very sorry for the way I've been treating you, and to return this. He produced the bracelet, but she didn't take it. Please take it, or Kate will never forgive me. She forbade me from coming by the house, and I want to make amends for making you cry. Ruth, please forgive me. Please just leave me alone, she said softly. All I want to do is make enough money and go back to Maryland. I don't want any trouble with you. Ruth, he came closer, and she shrank back. I'll try to be better. Please don't be scared of me. He held the bracelet out once again, and she took it. I also got you these to say I'm sorry. These were a pair of earrings to match the bracelet. Monroe can't fix clasps on items made of gold, so I had to travel to Sacramento to get it done. That's where I saw these earrings and decided to get them for you. He took them out of their box and held them out of their box and held them out for her to see. They were made of gold and dangled in his large hand. He shook them slightly and they tinkled merrily. Thank you. They are beautiful, but I can't take them. Why not? It's a peace offering, dear girl. Okay, I forgive you. But you didn't have to buy me earrings. I didn't have to, but I wanted to. He looked so earnest that she decided to accept his peace offering. Thank you. Now please smile, because Kate might be watching me like a hawk ready to pounce on a chick. The analogy caused her to giggle. That's better. I like your smile, Ruth, and you should do it more often. I smile a lot, but not when people are being nasty to me. Ruthie, Jeremiah groaned. You're breaking my heart. He put a hand over his heart and pretended to stumble backwards. He was always so dramatic, and even though they argued a lot, she'd found herself thinking about him so much. What can I do to make you keep smiling? Jeremiah Rusher, please leave me alone. She turned away, hiding the blush that was creeping up her neck. Don't bother me now. You really want me to go? Or are you just saying that to hide the truth that you like my company? He teased. I'm a handsome and charming young man who has bestowed his smile upon you. Please accept it. Knowing that if she stayed there, she would give herself away, Ruth rose up and fled towards the house, Jeremiah's soft laugh following her. His laugh died down to a smile as he saw her entering the house. What was it about this woman that made him unable to stay away from her? Did he like her as his brothers had suggested? During the past month that Ruth had been in John and Kate's home, he'd been here more times than in all the 2 years that they were married. He wasn't as indifferent to her as he pretended to be, just so his brothers wouldn't tease him. And from the way she had fled from him, he had the feeling that she, too, wasn't indifferent to him. He didn't know why the thought gave him a warm feeling inside, and he couldn't stop smiling. He was sad that he had made her cry, but at least things were better between them now, and he whistled as he went towards the front door. Kate would be happy and not scowl at him all the time now. Ruth ran into her bedroom and sat down on the bed, covering her face with her palms, the bracelet and earrings clasped in one hand. She was behaving like an idiot in as far as Jeremiah Rusher was concerned, but could she blame herself? The man was driving her crazy, showing up unannounced, and causing her heart to race. What was wrong with her? She tried on the earrings and loved them, deciding to let them stay on. He had good taste. She had to give him that. She placed the bracelet in the small box on her bedside table, which contained her mother's jewelry, and then stood in front of the mirror and stared long and hard at herself, finally admitting what she had been denying all along. She was in love with Jeremiah Rusher, and the thought troubled her. What was wrong with her? Feeling too cooped up inside, she went outside again through the back door and hoped that she wouldn't run into Jeremiah again. The earrings danced with every step she took, and she smiled at the soft, tinkling sound they made. What was she going to do about her feelings for Jeremiah? Perhaps avoiding him would do the trick because one dose of him every few days was enough. Thank you very much. He was the kind of man who made sensible girls like her turn into senseless idiots. Wandering along the path that led to the garden and beyond to the small copse, she thought about Jeremiah. He was the most handsome man she'd ever met, and even Ted Dyke paled in comparison. Jeremiah was what one of the young waitresses back in D.C. would call a man's man. With all his flexing muscle, she had also seen the grace underneath it all, and the tenderness when he held his niece or nephew. He puzzled her a lot, and she sighed as she went on with her short walk. It was early afternoon, and Kate and the babies were asleep, but she needed to return and help Mrs. Pedler with preparations for dinner. But a few minutes more wouldn't hurt, so she went on walking. A few days before, she discovered a small stream and she walked towards it, feeling very restless. She would dip her feet in it so she could calm down, and then it would be back home. The trees weren't all that tall, and she contemplated climbing up one of them so she could have a view of the surrounding area. She actually started up one before she saw a small snake slithering on one of the upper branches and gave a scream. Fear held her immobile as she watched the serpent coming towards her, its eyes holding her in horrified fascination, until suddenly she was plucked away from the imminent danger. She heard the angry hissing of the serpent as a blow struck and it fell lifeless to the ground, and she also felt the strong and protective pressure of the arms, locked round her. "Are you all right?" The harsh sound of Jeremiah's voice reverberated through her body. Where had he come from? She hadn't seen him at all as she left the house, but she was glad to have him close by. Feeling a wave of faintness rush over her even as she fought against it, she gave a tiny moan and Jeremiah's arms tightened. "Ruthie, it's all right. You're perfectly safe now." His voice was rough with concern, while his arms shielded her from danger. "Don't look at that thing. It has no power to harm you or anyone else ever again." She had a dangerously weak impulse, simply to lie against his chest and close her eyes, enjoying the warmth and comfort of being held by Jeremiah and feeling safe. But she had to overcome the weakness, so she struggled to be free. His arms tightened even more, and she thought he wasn't going to release her, but then he did so. As she stepped back from him, she caught sight of his grimly white face and realized just how great the danger had been. "Don't look at it," he repeated, kicking the lifeless body under the leaves with his foot. "Be careful next time before climbing trees in early summer. Serpents and scorpions crawl out of their holes to get warm. I'm just so happy that you arrived when you did. I've never encountered anything like that before, and I just froze. Then it's a good thing I was following you and noticed the snake." "But how did you see it when I didn't even notice it at first?" Living out here makes a person very alert to the possibilities of danger lurking around every corner. Most of this land is still uninhabited, and there are a lot of creeping and crawling dangers. If you want to take a walk out here, please wait until someone who knows this place is with you. Thank you so much for saving my life. That thing would probably have killed me. It's a baby bull snake, and though it's not poisonous, its bite can be very painful, and the lacerations can cause you to bleed heavily. I don't ever want to come into contact with anything like that again. So no more walks for me." She shuddered. Jeremiah laughed and pulled her close with one hand. "Actually, most serpents are terrified of human beings and choose to run away rather than confront us. This one had probably feasted on birds' eggs, and that's why it was lethargic." He saw the horror on her face and could have kicked himself. "I'm sorry. Let me get you back to the house. You're pretty shaken up, and my lesson isn't making you feel better." "I'm just glad that you're here with me," she said shyly, and then pulled away once again. That night, too restless to sleep, Ruth decided to use the time for something useful. So she knelt down on the floor and pulled out the small box that she had kept hidden under her bed ever since she arrived in Kate's house. It was the one that Vicar Jones had handed her, and she sat on the warm carpeted floor. This was all she had left of her father's belongings, and she felt the tears behind her eyes. Why had he given it to Reverend Jones? There must be something important in it, and the only way to find out was to open it. The very first thing she found as soon as she opened the box was an old wedding photograph of her parents. They had been so young and happy, their eyes filled with hope for the future. She studied the photograph forlornly for several minutes. It was obvious this photo had been really dear to her father, for it was frayed on the sides as if it had lain for a long time in his wallet. Seeing it once again brought back such strong memories that she bowed her head and wept. There were other things in the box, but it was the documents at the bottom that caught her eye, and she gasped as she read the contents. Chapter 9. Catching No Break. The moment Ruth woke up a few days later, she had a premonition that something bad was about to happen. She went through the motions of doing her chores and tried to ignore her feelings, but the uneasiness didn't go away. If anything, it grew worse as the day progressed. She was cleaning the porch when she noticed a vehicle coming up the driveway. It wasn't one that belonged to any member of Kate and John's family, and she was sure that she could identify them all. The moment she recognized the woman stepping out of the buggy, her heart sank. No wonder that she had been uneasy. Her stepmother being here didn't bode well for her at all, and she was sure Bianca had only come to cause trouble. Bianca seemed really impressed by Kate and John's house, and she stood there staring at it for a while before she remembered what had brought her. "So this is where you have been hiding now." She had a malicious look on her face. "Who was the poor idiot that you deceived into promising to marry you? He looks really rich, and I have to admit that you know how to choose wealthy men. Ruth." Before Ruth could respond, John walked out of the house. He was on his way to the office as usual, and when Bianca saw him, she hurried towards him. "Are you Mr. Rusher?" "That I am? Who are you?" He didn't come down the steps. "My name is Bianca Gladstone, and I have a complaint against Ruth here." "Gladstone? Are you any relation of hers?" "She's my stepdaughter." "Really?" John looked at Ruth as if willing her to respond, but Bianca was faster. "She ran away from Maryland because of what she knows she did." "And what did Miss Gladstone do?" Ruth stared at her stepmother as she spewed out her lies. "This woman is a thief and very wicked. She left me and my daughter quite destitute after her father died, saying that we didn't deserve anything from him. She was always jealous of Eugenie and said we would regret why we ever set foot in her father's house." Ruth saw the expression on John's face, and her heart started fainting. Would her troubles never end, and would her stepmother always be there to cause problems for her? "Mrs. Gladstone, why are you really here?" John cut through the tirade, sounding impatient. A sly look came into Bianca's eyes. "I'm a good citizen and just wanted to make sure that you're not being taken advantage of, Mr. Rusher. Ruth here was engaged to Theodore Dyke. I think you know him at John's nod," she went on. "But she also had another man who she was deceiving back home in Annapolis. With Ruth, it's always about money, and she thought that man at home had lots of it. When she found out that he was just a simple bank clerk, she decided that Ted was a good catch after all." Bianca threw a triumphant look at Ruth. "She rejected Ted, but when the other man didn't live up to her greedy standards, she decided to follow my daughter here. Good thing we had told Ted the truth, and he decided to marry Eugenie instead of this one. Now Ruth has snared you, and I just thought you should be careful, that's all." Kate had come to stand on the porch and was watching what was going on. "Is everything all right? Mrs. Gladstone came here with a complaint against Ruth, and I would like to help her." John turned to Ruth. "Would you please take her inside? I have to rush somewhere, but we'll be back as soon as possible." He waited until they were at the door before he spoke again. "Mrs. Gladstone, whatever the case, please don't leave until I return. I promise that I won't be long." "Yes, sir," Bianca smiled smugly. "Ruth, bring the visitor into the house." Kate disappeared before they entered the house. Once inside, Ruth saw Bianca's eyes widen with appreciation and something like greed. Her stepmother had always been an opportunist, and Ruth could see the wheels turning in her mind as she thought of how she was going to exploit this situation. "Who is that woman?" Bianca demanded, but Ruth chose to ignore her. She didn't want to be in the same room with this woman and her venomous words, but she didn't trust her enough to leave her alone. Bianca was a troublemaker, and there was no telling what she could get into if left alone. "She looks really angry. Is she your fiancé's sister or something?" "Or something," Ruth murmured, wishing John would return soon. Why had he insisted that Bianca stay here to wait for him? John was gone for about half an hour, and when he returned, Jeremiah, Jed, Ted, and Eugenie were with him. Something like fear entered Bianca's eyes when she saw them entering the house. "What's going on?" "You came here accusing Ruth and I just wanted your daughter and her husband to be present as you made those allegations." John pointed at Jeremiah and Jed. "These are my brothers," and when Kate walked in, he put an arm around her. "I know you thought that I was the man Ruth is engaged to, but this is my wife, Kate." "Now, Mrs. Bianca Gladstone, what accusation do you bring against Ruth, your stepdaughter?" "Those aren't allegations. This girl is truly bad and refused to leave Woodland because she wants to break up my daughter's marriage. I met her at the store the other day, and she had an expensive engagement ring and told me she was engaged. Naturally, I got concerned and didn't want her to cause any more trouble." Jeremiah was studying Ruth's face, and he could see that she was really pale. But Bianca was still talking, and he turned to look at her, seeing the malice and hatred in her eyes, and was shocked. How could someone be so eager to cause another pain? What kind of woman was this, and how had Ruth lived with her? Ruth is a very, let's say, easy girl with her favors. Back in D.C., I had a difficult time trying to keep her on the straight and narrow path. She messed up her life back there and followed my daughter here so she could break up her marriage. "No, Mother, please don't say that." Eugenie spoke up, and Ruth turned to look at her stepsister in surprise. Her stepsister was defending her for the first time in her life. "That's not true." "Shut up, you insolent child. What do you know? Your marriage is in trouble because this girl refused to leave Woodland and she can never be trusted. I know that her plan is to find a way of seducing your husband away from you." "Mother, please." Eugenie was in tears, and Ted put his arm around her. "Please tell the truth. Ruth isn't trying to hurt me. You and I know the truth. Please just leave her alone." "She is trying to live her life. Why did you have to come here and spoil things for her?" "If you don't shut up, I'll—" The rest of the words faded when she noticed people observing her with shock. She gave a small laugh. This girl has always been melodramatic and blind to other people's faults. She is defending someone who deserves to be in jail for her offenses. "Mother, please speak the truth," Eugenie begged, holding her hands out. "Truth?" Bianca practically screeched, and it was all Ruth did not to block her ears. She could see the rest wincing at the sound. "You want to tell the truth now, do you?" She turned to Ted. "Has your dear little wife told you that she's been living a lie for the past 4 months?" "What?" Ted's hand fell from his wife's shoulders. "What is your mother talking about?" "I don't know," Eugenie said in a small voice, her face quite pale. Bianca's harsh bark of laughter made Eugenie shrink back against the cushions, and Ruth felt sorry for her. Her sister had lived under this woman's control, and not for the first time. She was thankful that she had managed to break away. Even if Bianca spoiled her chances of living in Woodland, she was now very good at her job and had been saving her money. She could always leave and go to San Francisco, Sacramento, or Los Angeles and find work as a nanny and housekeeper if cashier jobs weren't available. Her savings would enable her to find a small apartment and pay rent for a few months in advance as she looked for a job. Don't sit there looking like a little angel when we know that you married Ruth's fiancé under false pretenses. Again I ask, what is your mother talking about, Eugenie? She looks like butter won't melt in her mouth, but she was the one who started all this. Bianca had such an ugly expression on her face that shocked everyone into silence, and they just watched to see what she would do. It was Eugenie who stole the letters that you'd written to Ruth and convinced me that you were the right man for her. She's always been good at copying other people's handwriting and signatures. That letter she gave you when we arrived wasn't from Ruth. It was Eugenie who wrote it and also lied when she said there was another man in Ruth's life. Ruth didn't reject you or say any of the things that Eugenie told you. This one wanted to take her sister's place by any means necessary. She turned to look at Ruth. You know what else? It was Eugenie who forged your father's signature many times so she could withdraw money from his account. Ask her yourself. Mother, please. Eugenie sobbed and Ruth stared at her in stunned silence. No wonder that the box upstairs had some check stubs. Maybe her father had discovered the anomalies and kept them as evidence, but before he could use them, had died. Her father hadn't been extravagant. These two had stolen his money. You wanted the truth to be told. Now it's all out in the open. Is what your mother's saying true? Ted slowly rose to his feet. He looked at her, disgust etched on his face. Now that I think about it, I had a problem with the bank the other day. He looked at the others. The bank manager sent for me and told me that one of my checks wasn't properly signed. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but gave him another one. So you were also stealing my money, Eugenie? Eugenie looked like a cornered rat, and Ruth felt sorry for her, even though she was really angry. It was Mother who made me do it, she said in a small voice. I had to. This girl is a liar, Bianca shouted hotly, her face quite red. Ask her what she did to Ruth and the lies she told about her. Is this true, Eugenie? Did you lie against your sister? What kind of a person are you? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Really? Is that what you have to say? I sent Ruth away, and if these kind people hadn't taken her in, what would have happened to her? Ted, please. I did a foolish thing, but have been repenting every day since then. She tried to reach for her husband's hand, but he stepped away. Ted, Ruth already forgave me. Please don't turn your back on me. Where will I go if you do? But her husband had a shuttered expression on his face. I never want to see you or your mother again. His voice was so cold that Ruth saw her sister shiver. Right now, I'm going to ask Maria to pack all your belongings, and you can expect them to be dropped to you wherever you want. But don't either of you set foot in my homestead again. He shook his head. I never knew that when I married you, I had married a thief, a liar, and a forger. Be it lucky for you, I'm willing to overlook the forgery and not hand you over to the sheriff, though you deserve it. And saying that, he left. Now see what you've done. Bianca turned angrily to Ruth. Are you happy now that my daughter's marriage is over? Jeremiah was watching Ruth as the commotion was going on, and he saw how distraught she was. Without a second thought, he got off his seat and walked over to her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. Mrs. Gladstone, he winked at Ruth, and she felt that everything would be all right. You mistakenly thought my brother John was Ruth's fiancé and so came here to stir up trouble. Good thing, too, because had you come to the Russia Ranch, I would have driven you away with a rifle. What insolence! Bianca gasped. How dare you speak to me like that? How dare you come into my brother's house to cause trouble for the woman I love? All eyes, including Ruth's, turned to him. Yes, Mrs. Gladstone, I'd like you to know that I'm the one who is going to marry Ruth. What do you possibly see in this woman? She's... Be very careful of your next words, because I won't take too kindly to you or anyone else. His eyes turned to Eugenie, saying anything bad about my fiancé. I love her, and that's all that matters. The problem is you, Mrs. Gladstone. You're delusional and a bad person, Mrs. Gladstone, if you'll pardon me for saying that. With your own hands, you've torn your daughter's marriage apart, and now you want to blame it on my fiancé. But silence, Jed roared. I don't want to hear any more of your venomous words here, woman. You are pure evil and wicked. Get out of this house at once and stay away from this family and especially Ruth, or so help me, you'll be sorry for the rest of your life. Seeing that everyone was prepared to defend Ruth, Bianca threw her hands in the air. Eugenie, come with me at once. It's quite obvious that this woman has poisoned these people's minds against us. I'm not going anywhere with you again, Mother, Eugenie said. She went to Ruth and stood behind her. Please don't let her take me away. Let me stay with you because my husband doesn't want me to go back home with him. Having found strength by being defended by Jeremiah and his brothers, Ruth felt that she could confront her stepmother. Leave Eugenie alone. She turned to her sister. Of course, you can stay with me, but I have your back always, Eugenie. Your husband is a good man, and I know that once he calms down, he will take you back. Ted was so angry, Eugenie wept. I did this to myself. All this tension isn't good for you and the baby, she turned to Kate. Can my sister lie in my room for a while as I go and find her husband? Of course, but let me show her to the room while you go and do what you have to do. Thank you so much. I'm coming with you, Jeremiah said, and Ruth was glad to have him with her. She had no idea how Ted would react, and Jeremiah seemed like he could be of much help. We'll be back shortly. Kate stood in the doorway and looked at Eugenie. Let's get one thing clear, she told the younger woman, her tone very cool. I'm only doing this because I like Ruth very much. You and your mother are terrible people and have put her through a lot. But yet she still defends you because she has a good heart. I'm sorry. You better know that we all have Ruth's back. My brother-in-law Jeremiah is in love with her, and we're standing by him in every way. We rushers stick together and fight against anyone who tries to cause trouble for any of us. I didn't come to cause any trouble. I believe you, but just in case you ever get it into your mind to hurt Ruth again, just know that none of us will take to it kindly. Ted is a good friend of my husband, and one word from John, and you'll be on a train back to wherever you came from, which I think you deserve. Kate shook her head. How could you allow yourself to do such wicked things to someone who never harmed you? Didn't you ever stop to think that your actions would one day have terrible consequences? It was my mother. If you use that excuse one more time, I'll kick you out of this house. Stop behaving like a child and take responsibility for your wrongdoings. Your mother didn't force you into doing any of the things you did, and I know you were a willing party because you wanted to hurt Ruth. Kate observed for a while, then made an impatient sound. That's it. You're jealous of Ruth. Even after you stole her fiancé away, it wasn't enough. You had to come here and stir up more trouble. I didn't come here. It was your husband who brought me. And I'm glad that he did because now we know the truth. So you and your mother are responsible for wrecking Ruth's life. That's unforgivable, and perhaps you should just go to your husband. He's already rejected me, Eugenie sobbed. Do you blame him for doing that? You stole your stepfather's money and your sister's letters, forged her handwriting, and said terrible things about her to the man she was supposed to get married to. Are you proud of what you've done? No. Oh, Eugenie sobbed. I have not had peace in my life at all. Well, the Bible puts it very well. There's no peace, says my Lord, for the wicked. Please, I'm sorry. Kate sighed, feeling compassion welling up within her. The girl was just a puppet that was controlled by her mother. It's all right. As long as you are truly repentant and remorseful, about your wrongdoing, you will receive grace and forgiveness. Ruth is a good person and won't hold any of this against you. Thank you." Ted was in the process of carrying Eugenie and Bianca's trunks out of his house when they got there. Ruth shook her head when she thought about the first time that she had set foot in this home. She'd been shamed and humiliated and had never expected to return. "Ted," she walked up to him. "I have a right to be heard," she said, and he nodded briskly. "Do come in." But we won't stay long. Ruth and Jeremiah followed him into the house. "Thank you for agreeing to speak to me." "Do I have a choice?" He motioned for them to sit down, and they did, side by side. "I'm sorry that we have intruded into your life, but Eugenie is my sister." Stepsister. She said so very many times, and her mother emphasized it. "That doesn't matter at all. My father adopted her, and she became his child from when she was 3. But that's not the issue here. Eugenie and your baby need you, Ted." His laugh was harsh. "That woman and her mother are crazy, and I don't want to have anything to do with them." He gave her a sympathetic look. "They told me that you had taken all your father's money and left them destitute, yet it was Eugenie who forged your father's signature and stole his money." He slapped his forehead with his open palm. "I was a fool to believe their every word, and it serves me right for what I did." "Ted, please calm down." Ruth looked at Jeremiah, who nodded. "It's obvious that you love Eugenie, but there are a lot of things that you need to work out. You see, she was just a baby of 3 years old when my father married Bianca. All her life, Bianca has controlled everything she did and said, and I guess she just doesn't know how to take care of herself. I know that what my sister did was a terrible thing, but temper your justice with mercy. I've chosen to forgive her so she can find peace again. Just a few days ago, we met at the store and we talked briefly. It's clear that Eugenie is really remorseful about what she did." Ted sat down and ran a hand through his hair. "I love my wife, as you say, but this marriage won't work." "Why not? You love her, and I know she also loves you." "Because of her mother. That woman is very demanding, and I know that I'm not a poor man, but even I have to draw the line at extravagance. Bianca demands so much, and it's like she is a member of this marriage. I can't be married to a woman and her mother." Ruth prayed silently that things weren't over for her sister. "Now, this check forgery issue is also something I can't deal with. I have lost my trust in Eugenie, and I don't think a marriage filled with suspicion can ever work. Ted, Eugenie needs your forgiveness. Deep down, I believe she's not a bad person, but being the daughter of someone like Bianca is something else. Eugenie stood up to her own mother to defend me even though she knew the consequences, and even now she has refused to leave Kate's house. You have to help her get back on her feet again. She's a good person, only confused and misguided, but she was the one who reached out to me and asked for forgiveness. That was before we found out about her forgeries. She could be pretending so she can rob me like she did with your father. I know that, but I'm going to try and understand the influence that she was under. When a child grows up under the hand of wickedness and evil, they start to believe that it's normal. That's the case with Eugenie. Please forgive my sister." Ted nodded and Ruth sighed in relief. Things would be tough for him and Eugenie, but she was sure that they would work them out. "Let's go and get my wife back." Eugenie didn't leave Ruth's room until they returned, and immediately when she saw her husband, started crying. "I'm so sorry, Ted, for putting you through all this." "One thing is clear, Eugenie," he said in a firm voice. "You have to choose between your mother and me. I don't want to continue pretending that all is well when things have been going wrong for a long time now. There's no peace in our home because of your mother and her interference in our marriage. If you want to go with her, then well and good. Once you have the baby, you know where to find me so I can take up responsibility for him or her. But as long as you continue to be tied to your mother's apron strings, this marriage is over." He twisted his lips. "You're a grown woman and have to choose whether you want to be a wife and soon to be mother, or continue to behave like a little girl under your mother's influence. Ted, please. You have a choice to make. I know that you love your mother, but enough is enough, and you have to choose right now, else there's nothing more for me to say. Your sister was the one who stopped me from bringing your stuff over, even though Maria packed your mother's and I have brought it. Simple thing for me to do, to go back home and bring your property. What's your decision?" "Eugenie," Bianca said in a softer voice, "I'm your mother and have your best interests at heart. It's clear that Ruth went to further poison your husband against you so that he has now come here with unreasonable demands." "Mother, please stop." Eugenie covered her ears. "Can't you for once just be a nice person? I love my husband, and what he says is true. This marriage can't hold the three of us." She moved towards her husband. "I'm choosing you, Ted," and she fell into his open arms. "Will you stop being foolish and come here right now? This isn't the only man on earth, you know. You're young and beautiful, and as soon as you have the baby, he will take responsibility. You'll find a better man who will treat you with much more respect." No mother in her husband's arms, Eugenie had found strength. "I love my husband, and we're going to work at making our marriage a good one. Please just leave us alone." She turned back to Ted and looked into his face. "I know that I have damaged the trust you had in me, but I will work hard and change if you will help me. If you're truly honest, then I will." He kissed her on the forehead. "Why you?" Bianca rushed at Eugenie, but Ted stood in her way. "Out of my way. I want to take my child away from all your madness." "Your child, as you call her, doesn't want to go with you. In any case, she is a married woman and being her husband. I have all rights over her and not you." Bianca changed tactics. Clutching her chest, she doubled over. Ruth wanted to roll her eyes because she knew that her stepmother was putting on a show to get attention. "My heart," she cried out, and Jed led her to a chair. "My heart is broken." She started weeping loudly. "My own child has turned against me all because of this." Catching Jeremiah's eye, she shut up and instead slumped. "Mama!" Eugenie was immediately on her knees beside her mother. "I'm sorry. Please don't die." Jed helped her back to her feet and pushed her towards her husband. "Your mother will be just fine. I'm going to drive her to hospital." "I'll come with you." Eugenie took a step forward, but Ruth shook her head. Eugenie was in a very fragile emotional state now, and Ruth was completely convinced that Bianca was faking her illness. If she got the poor girl in her clutches again, there was no telling what kind of damage she could do to her, especially in the light of what she had found out while going through her father's papers. "Eugenie, you've been through a lot. Stay here with your husband. The two of you have a lot to work out, so stay, and I'll go with Mother and make sure that she's all right." "Thank you." Eugenie covered her face with her hands. "I'm so sorry for causing so much trouble." "Don't worry. All is well." Ruth touched her shoulder. "When Mother is settled at the hospital, I'll be back to make sure that you're also all right." She turned to Ted. "Please take care of my sister. I'll be back soon." Of course, Ted once again put his arms around his sobbing wife, and by the time Ruth left, she knew that they would be all right. Chapter 10. The Truth is Out. The ride to the hospital was made in silence, which was broken from time to time by Bianca's groans and moans, which sounded fake to Ruth's ears. What made her so happy was that Jed was driving the buggy while Jeremiah held her hand. Their fingers were entwined and she looked up at him. "You don't have to ever worry about anything again, Ruth. I'm right here for you." "Thank you. It means a lot to me." Ruth was not surprised when they got to the hospital, and Bianca said she was feeling fine as soon as she was taken to the examination room. She waited until everyone had left before she turned on Ruth. "You have always been a troublemaker, Ruth, and don't think that you have won. Eugenie will always listen to me, and after I'm done taking her away from that good-for-nothing mean man, I'll make sure that no man in Woodland or elsewhere ever marries or even looks at you." Ruth threw her head back and laughed, surprising her stepmother. "Oh, dear Bianca," she shook her head. "You're very shrewd and cunning. I've got to give you that. Don't you realize that you've lost? Leave Eugenie alone so she can finally have a normal life away from your bad influence. Poor child has always thought that you were doing her well, but what's to be expected from a mere nanny?" "What do you mean?" Bianca asked, but there was a slight tremor in her voice. "Stepmother, you have a choice." Ruth's voice was cold and firm, though she was shaking inside. She'd never stood up to her stepmother in all 13 years that Bianca had been married to her father. "You'll leave Woodland and never return again." "You can't make me do anything," Bianca scoffed. "Just because you're engaged to that man who wears fancy clothes, you now think you can dictate the terms of my life." "I won't say it again, Bianca. You see, last night I couldn't sleep, so I started sorting through Papa's papers, which I brought with me from Maryland. My father knew that he was dying, and so took his important papers to Reverend Jones for safekeeping, and those were given to me on the day I left home. Would you like to guess what I found out, dear stepmother?" Bianca's haughty look slipped, and Ruth saw something like fear in her eyes. "What did you find?" "Your fake passport and Eugenie's 2 birth certificates and her passport. It became quite clear to me that my sister isn't your daughter and something must have happened to her parents, and she ended up in your custody when she was very small. If you had been as wise as you always thought of yourself, you would have destroyed those documents. But I'm guessing you kept them so you could one day use them against Eugenie." Ruth shook her head. "I used to wonder why you spoiled her so much, but now I realize that you were just slowly destroying her life, and to control her life forever, you made her very dependent on you. Poor girl." "Why, you little rat. My father found out that you've been pretending to be Eugenie's mother all this while, and that you're not who you really say you are. I suspect that when you knew this to be true, you killed my father so you could continue hiding your dirty little secret. And now that I think about it, that's the reason you wouldn't let me have access to any of Papa's documents. Well, sadly for you, he was smarter than you ever gave him credit for, and hid the important papers and gave them to the vicar for safekeeping. He knew that one day the truth would have to be told. My father has always enjoyed good health, and even with the debts he'd accumulated because of your overspending and lavish lifestyle, he would have worked very hard to set things right. Papa wasn't one to give up. I know that you were the one who forced Eugenie to forge his signatures so you could steal his money. You have no proof of what you're saying." Bianca was really shaken. "No one will believe your silly made-up story that I killed my husband." Ruth laughed, a brittle sound that made Bianca wince. "It won't take the pathologist long to determine that you must have poisoned my father or something. You see, I'm going to hand over all the proof I have to the sheriff so he can call in the authorities. Once I do that, I'll request my father's body to be exhumed so the truth can finally be revealed. No one will believe your lies. You're the one who has been lying to yourself that you can never get caught. Oh, and one more thing. The check stubs that Eugenie signed were also in the box my father left for me. Bianca laughed. You're too soft and won't turn your sister in. No, but I will convince her to turn state's witness, and with my testimony and the other evidence I have, you're facing a lifetime in jail, dear Bianca, beloved stepmother. I'll kill you for this. And just as she made to rush towards Ruth, the door opened and Jeremiah and the doctor entered. She screamed and charged, but Jeremiah was faster and grabbed her, restraining her while the doctor sent for the sheriff. Ted, Eugenie couldn't believe that she was back in her husband's house. Maybe he had brought her here to punish her some more. Do you really forgive me? Ted looked long and hard at his wife. I just want to know one thing, Eugenie. Yes. When you were doing all those things, did it ever occur to you that you were doing wrong? She nodded. I take full responsibility for the part that I played in trying to hurt Ruth. I can no longer blame my mother for all those things that I did. Good, he nodded. And do you realize that your sister can have you jailed for forgery? Mine was a single check, and for very little money. I'm sure you took a lot of money from your stepfather. Would you care to tell me how much in total? Eugenie twisted her fingers nervously. I don't know the exact figure. Try. I thought you forgave me. I have, but I need to know what I'm coming up against. Your mother is definitely going to come back and accuse you of masterminding the whole thing, and it will come out in court that you stole from your stepfather. I want to be prepared on how to defend you should that arise. How much money did you steal? It was about 20,000. Do you think Ruth will turn against me? She started crying. Would you blame her? He asked in a quiet voice, and she shook her head. I've never seen someone hurt so badly but willing to forgive so much. Will you help me? I will, but on one condition. I'll do anything for you, Ted. You're going to cut off all ties with your mother. You won't go to see her in the hospital. You won't ever speak to her if she ever comes here, and you won't write to her. If you go back on this, then I will cut you off and let you deal with whatever come. She's my mother. I know that, but look at the influence she had over you. Would you like to continue living that kind of life? No. Then for as long as you keep your side of the bargain and never have anything to do with your mother, we'll be all right. Yes, Ted. Eugenie? Yes? I mean, every word I say. I know. Chapter 11. Peace at Last. You took a great risk, and my heart was shaking for you when I heard you telling your stepmother all those things. That woman is pure evil and wickedness and could have hurt you so badly. Now that it was all over, Ruth was shaking. She couldn't believe that she had stood up to her stepmother. Even though Bianca hadn't confessed her wrongdoings, she hadn't denied the accusations leveled at her. The person she felt most sorry for was Eugenie, having to find out that she wasn't Bianca's daughter. Jeremiah, how will I tell Eugenie that the woman who has been controlling her life isn't her mother? You'll find a way, and I know Ted will help her come to terms with the truth. He's a good man, and she is exactly what he needs. Thank you for being here for me. Ruth took a deep breath. It was terrifying having to face my stepmother and tell her those things. But it's all over now. He pulled her into his arms. Remember what I told you that day in the woods? You said many things. Like that serpent which I killed. This woman can never harm you or anyone else again. She will get what's coming to her, especially if the autopsy shows that she poisoned your father. I always thought there was something odd about the way Bianca treated Eugenie, as if she was overcompensating for something, and the way she wouldn't let my stepsister get close to anyone. It now turns out that she was scared of anyone finding out the truth. I wonder what happened to Eugenie's real parents. We'll never know unless Bianca reveals the truth. To think that for 13 years that imposter lived in our home, Ruth was trembling and Jeremiah's arms tightened around her. When Papa first brought her home to introduce her and Eugenie to me, she was so sweet and kind, and I was happy that I was getting a new mother. How old were you? The very first time she came, I was just turning 7, but it took a year for Papa to marry her, adopt Eugenie and bring them home. And in all that time, she would come to the house, bring me candy, braid my hair, let me play with Eugenie, and she always said that we would be great sisters together. Ruth laughed, but it was a sad sound that pulled at Jeremiah's heart. His beloved had suffered so much. But she was just trying to make my father think she was a good person. It was just a few weeks after marrying her that Papa discovered just what kind of a person she was. For your sake, he should have put her away. Ruth shook her head. In a way, I'm glad that he didn't. The Reverend back at home told me that my father hoped that some of his goodness and my influence would get Eugenie to be someone unlike her mother, and he was right. My sister has also a lot to deal with once she finds out that for so many years she was just a pawn in Bianca's larger plot. It's a wonder that she didn't kill me also. Let's not talk anymore about that wicked woman. My family must be wondering where we are at. I'm just glad that you were here to restrain her. For a moment, I really thought that Bianca was going to kill me. Believe me, someone as deranged as that would have done it without an ounce of remorse. But that's the end of her, and from here on, it's you and I. Ruth remembered that they were still in hospital and tried pull away. Where do you think you're going? Anyone could walk in on us, she murmured, blushing furiously when he still refused to let her go. Please let me go. Not before you tell me that you love me. I do? He held her by the shoulders and gave her an exasperated look. You like spurring with me, young lady, and I like the dance. Just think, decades from now, we'll tell our grandchildren all about how we met, and how their grandmother held a big stick in her hand and wanted to thwack me on the head with it. And you deserved it, coming at me like that? Her tone became indignant. Did I look like a kidnapper to you? He grinned. Of course not. But you looked really beautiful when you were angry, and now I know what to do to keep you always looking this beautiful. What? Keep you angry. Be careful I don't thwack you on the head. The door opened and Jed put his head inside the room. Oh, you're still here. We were talking. Jeremiah tried to get his brother to leave, but the man was either ignoring his signals or didn't understand what he was trying to do. Have they taken that woman away? Yes. Gaines is most angry that someone like that could have lived among us. He's calling her a French spy who has come to check out the land so that her government can invade America. They laughed, honestly. Gaines should write a detective or espionage novel because he has a very crazy imagination. I need to get back home, Ruth said, and moved towards the door. Kate and John have their hands full with the twins, and I need to be there to help. Ruth was restless, and Kate noticed it. The two women were on the porch watching the children as they played in their pen, built by John and Joshua. They were still too small to sit up, but they could raise their legs in the air and make a lot of noise. "Is something bothering you, Ruth?" "No, yes," she sighed. "I don't know. I think I'm just being foolish." "What do you mean?" "It's nothing. Ruth, I'm a woman and one who is deeply in love with my husband. I know that you love my brother-in-law." "How can you tell? Does it show?" Kate chuckled. "Dear girl, a woman in love is like the sun. She glows, and since I notice that you always react in this way when Jeremiah is somewhere in the vicinity, I guessed that he's the one causing you sleepless nights. What am I going to do?" "Love him as he loves you. Didn't he say that before your stepmother? I thought he was just being gallant and chivalrous, trying to protect me. Jeremiah has always been the joker of the family, but he's matured. I guess being around his big brothers who are married and now dropping nieces and nephews like flies has made him realize that he's a grown-up. He's a good man and will make you a wonderful husband. But he hasn't even asked me. It's just a matter of time. These Rusher men all like to do things in style." The 7 brothers were all seated in Joshua and Beth's house. Beth was at Abby's place with the children because they had said they wanted to have a sort of private meeting. "It's really nothing, but as the head of the family, I want to say that I'm proud of all of you." Jed looked at all his brothers. "We've been on this land for close to 10 years, and the Lord has done us well. We came a few, but now our numbers have increased and continue to do so. If I'm not wrong, we're about to welcome a new member to the family." All his brothers turned to look at him, and Jeremiah blushed. "We will be happy to receive your young lady into the family, Jeremiah. She hasn't accepted to marry me." "Have you asked her?" John wagged a finger at him. "You have to first ask a girl to marry you before she can say yes." Jeremiah realized that he'd not asked Ruth, but had just assumed that she knew he was in love with her. What an idiot he was! From the expression on our brother's face, I can deduce that he thought Ruth would just come skipping into his arms. Josiah said and ducked a soft blow. "Women like to be asked these things, Jeremiah." "Oh, so now you're the expert in women's affairs and love. You've been married, what, just about 6 months or so. But I'm still ahead of you." Boys. Jed raised his hands up. "We have to wrap this up before our wives come searching for us, thinking that we're planning something sinister." He pulled out a small box from his pocket. "Before Mama died, she gave this ring to me and told me that when I was sure that Jeremiah had found the right woman, I should give it to him." "Why not the rest of us?" Josiah protested. As the second to last born, he sometimes felt that everyone paid more attention to Jeremiah than to him. "Josiah, please don't be jealous. Jeremiah is the youngest and the one who spent the least amount of time with our mother. Remember that after he was born, she was always so sickly and didn't get to spend as much time as she would have liked with him. Maybe this was her way of showing Jeremiah that she loved him." Jed shrugged. "I don't know why she chose to give this ring to Jeremiah for his bride, but she did." "I'm only teasing," Josiah said. "We had wonderful times with Ma when she would play with us and all, but after Jeremiah came along, she could barely get out of bed." Josiah put a hand on his younger brother's shoulder. "You missed out on so much, but Ma loved you. She loved us all very much." "I don't know what to say," Jeremiah said as he received the ring from Jedediah. "It wasn't an expensive ring. Kate's rings outpriced this one by far. It was the thought behind it. Thank you, Jed." "Well, now can we get down to business?" which is from Jonathan. I asked us to be alone so that we can plan for a trip to Atlanta to visit Uncle Chris and get to meet the rest of Mama's family. We could make it sort of a honeymoon gift for Jeremiah, and indeed all of us. What about the ranch, our businesses? Joshua asked. The construction company I started is just picking up, and being away might take me back. I've considered all that. Dale is a good man and a wonderful neighbor. He's ready to watch things for us for about a month, for that's how long we'll be away. Deputy Gaines and even Theodore Dyke are ready to do whatever it takes to keep things running. I have no problem with that, John said. Mr. Langer was talking about going to check on some business interests of his back east. Kate and I were talking about taking the twins on their first long trip, so yes, I like the idea. One by one. The brothers talked about their issues, and in the end agreed that they would make the trip as soon as Jeremiah and Ruth got married. Now, in conclusion, Jeremiah, please go and ask Ruth to be your wife. We'd like to make this trip before winter, as those are the hardest months for the stock. Thank you so much, all of you. He rushed out of the house with one purpose in mind. Ruth was playing with the children when Jeremiah rushed into the house. Where's the fire? She asked him, feeling her heart thumping. Ruth, my darling. It was the first time he had called her that, and her cheeks colored. She dropped her head to hide the confusion she was feeling. He came closer and knelt down beside her, his fingers gently caressing her cheek. Ruth, do you know where I've just come from? No, her voice was unsteady. You know that I love you so much. He tilted her chin up. I love you so much, and my brother just gave me this. He took the ring out from his pocket. It belonged to our mother, and she had Jed keep it for me until I found the right woman for me. And I know that I found her in you, my dearest. Are you sure? Her voice trembled, and he knew that she was thinking about how Ted Dyke had rejected her. As sure as my heart is beating, his arm curved around her shoulders. I know you're thinking about Ted and what he did to you. But the poor man was deceived, and being over 30, he was desperate to marry and begin a family right away. He's very remorseful, but also pleased that through all this, he found a good woman, and now, enough of talking about other people's affairs. Will you marry me, my beloved? The twins screeched and clapped their hands in play. See, even my niece and nephew think it's a good idea. In that case, we can't disappoint the little ones, she said, and Jeremiah's heart finally settled down. Chapter 12. Grand Finale. The sun was shining on her wedding day, and Ruth woke up with a smile on her face. She lay in bed for a while, listening to what was going on downstairs. Because of her work with the babies, Kate had begged her to continue staying on her estate. They had even provided a guest house for the two of them, and Jeremiah was agreeable. They would live here for a while until Kate found proper help, and also while their own house was being built. She hopped out of bed so she could once again admire her dress. It had been made by Beth and Sophia, and the veil she would wear was on loan from Kate. The Rushers were amazing people, and she couldn't help smiling when she thought that from today she would be one of them. What's more, Eugenie would be coming for her wedding. Once Bianca was out of the picture, Eugenie had opened up, and they'd spent so many hours talking about their past and future. The door opened and her sister walked in. Good morning, beautiful bride-to-be. Eugenie, you're good for my spirit this morning. They hugged, and Ruth led her sister to the bed, and they both sat down. I don't want you straining yourself, okay? Besides, Ted would have my neck if something happened to you or the baby. Eugenie reached out a hand and placed it on Ruth's arm. I'm really sorry for what I did. Tears shimmered in her eyes. You could have been married to Ted. But I'm not. And it's clear that the man is crazy in love with you. Besides, it was because of all this that I met the man of my dreams. You look really happy. I am, Eugenie. I really am. And I can't wait to be married to Jeremiah. She twisted her lips sadly. I just wish Papa was here to walk me down the aisle like I dreamed of when I was a little girl. Papa was a good man, but at the time, I didn't realize it, Eugenie said, letting her tears fall. I can't remember much about my own parents, but Mr. Gladstone never once made me feel like I wasn't his daughter. But I repaid him by being very greedy and wicked. And all because of that wicked woman who pretended to be my mother. How did she manage to cover all our eyes all that time? Just days before, Ruth had told Eugenie the truth about Bianca, and the poor girl had wept so much that everyone got concerned, but finally she calmed down and said she would be all right. Even now, looking at her, Ruth could see the peace that was in her eyes. Yes, her sister would be all right. Hey, it's not your fault. Things just happened, but I'm glad that all that is behind us now. Papa found out somehow and was going to hand her over to the authorities, but she started poisoning him slowly. That's what eventually caused the heart attack that killed him. That's what the post-mortem revealed. No wonder Bianca didn't want it done the first time. I should have known, Eugenie sobbed, her stomach heaving. Eugenie, a woman like Bianca is so crafty that it's not easy to catch her. But our father somehow did, and now she'll spend the rest of her days in prison. May God have mercy on her demented soul. Thank you for standing up for me. I was so scared that you would testify against me about Papa's money. Eugenie, Ruth held her hand. You were just a child when that woman started using you for her own wicked schemes. Remember one time Papa told you that he wanted you to go to art school in Paris, and he was ready to pay for it, Eugenie nodded. It always puzzled me when Bianca became so hostile and wouldn't let you go. Now I understand that she knew that if she set foot in France, her sins would be discovered and she would go to jail. But you're a good artist and should take it up, Eugenie. I will. And that reminds me, I have a gift for you. It's a picture of you and Jeremiah that I painted. Really? Where is it? Ted is holding it for me. Eugenie shook her head. It's such an honor that you asked me to be your matron of honor. I don't deserve any of the kindness that you have shown me, Ruth. You're my sister, and you should remember that forever. I love you and will always be here for you. Papa would have wanted it this way. They held each other and wept for their father. It was Eugenie who regained control of her emotions first. Look at me being such a terrible matron of honor. She gave her sister a watery smile. I'm sorry for dampening the mood, and yet it's your wedding day. Don't worry about it, Eugenie. Ruth wiped her eyes. Our talks were long overdue, and we need more and more of them. But you're my sister, and I've always loved you. On a calm Sunday afternoon, in a church decked out with flowers and ribbons, Ruth and Jeremiah exchanged vows in front of their large family. Jacob was the ring bearer, and he took his duties really seriously as he led Amy and Bibi, the beautiful flower girls in pretty pink frocks, down the aisle right before the blushing bride made her glorious entrance. Ruth had asked Jed, as the patriarch of the family, to give her away in the absence of her father, and he told her that he was honored to do it. As he stepped back at the altar and Jeremiah took his place to stand beside her, it was their future began. A future of love and happiness to be shared with family and their children who would come along out of their love for each other. This is the beginning of our forever together, my darling Ruth. Jeremiah whispered in her ear just before he kissed her. And amen to that. The end. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable, but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive here for your enjoyment. God bless you, and thank you again for listening.